Betty Becker knew the back room wasn't meant for living because the heat register had been covered by a bookcase for 19 years. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the handle of her suitcase, while Brian pushed the narrow bookcase aside with his shoulder. Dust marked the carpet where it had been. The room had once held Donald's fishing gear, two folding tables, boxes of Christmas lights, and a treadmill nobody used after the motor began squealing. Now, it held a single bed Brian had bought that morning. The plastic still covered the mattress. A paper label hung from one corner. Betty's winter coats lay across the bed because there was nowhere to hang them. On the floor sat 3 cardboard boxes marked Mom in black ink. Brian looked around as if he'd completed a difficult repair. It's only temporary. Betty didn't move past the doorway. Behind her, voices carried from the kitchen. Her daughter-in-law was putting away the food people had brought after Donald's funeral. Cabinet doors opened and shut. Plastic containers slid across the refrigerator shelves. It sounded like any busy evening in the Becker house, except Betty no longer knew which cabinet held her tea. "Temporary until what?" she asked. "Until we get everything settled." The will was read yesterday. That doesn't settle everything. Brian crouched beside the wall register. He pulled away the old strip of tape around its edge, then tried the metal lever. "It sticks," Betty said. "Your father shut that one off years ago." "I'll look at it. You said that about the bathroom tap. I've had a lot going on, Mom." He stood and wiped his fingers on his trousers. Donald's trousers, Betty realized. Not the exact pair, but the brown wool ones Donald had worn to the produce company's winter dinners. Brian had taken several suits from the closet after the funeral, because they were nearly the same size. Betty let go of her suitcase. "Why am I in here?" Brian's face tightened. He had expected complaints about the register, the mattress, perhaps the lack of a lamp. He hadn't expected a question that plain. "You need your own space. I had my own space. That room is ours now." He said it softly. That made it worse. The family house on Maple Street had belonged to Donald's parents before Donald and Betty bought out his sister's share. Betty had lived there for 41 years. She had stripped wallpaper in the dining room, sanded every kitchen cabinet, planted the redbud beside the porch, and paid the mortgage from the household account, while Donald put most of his earnings back into Becker Produce. The will left the house to Brian. It also left him the company, its warehouse, trucks, packing equipment, and the reservoir tract along Waterworks Road. Donald had said for years that Brian would need the business kept whole. Betty had understood that. She'd assumed she would remain in the house because Donald had also said, many times, that no one would put her out of her own kitchen. Donald had been wrong about how much a spoken promise weighed after a funeral. Betty looked into the room again. There was no lock on the door. There was no bedside table. The nearest bathroom was down the hall, past the bedroom Brian and his wife had already moved into. "You carried my things in here while I was at Kathleen's? We needed to get organized. Who went through my dresser?" Brian glanced toward the kitchen. "We just moved it." "Who?" "My wife helped." Betty stepped inside and opened the first box. Her nightgowns had been pressed down beneath 2 framed photographs. Donald smiled up through the glass in one of them, standing beside an apple bin with his cap pushed back. The other showed Betty and Donald on the farmhouse porch at Becker Orchard, years before the porch rail began to sag. A silver hairbrush had been dropped on top of both frames. "This one is cracked," Betty said. "I'll replace the glass." She lifted the photograph. A thin break crossed Donald's shirt and continued through the apple bin. Brian reached for it, but Betty drew it against her chest. "Leave it." From the kitchen, his wife called, "Brian, the refrigerator people are here. I'll be there in a minute." Betty turned toward him. "What refrigerator people? The new one's being delivered. There's nothing wrong with mine. The freezer leaks. It needs a new gasket. We already ordered one." He meant a refrigerator, not a gasket. Betty understood from the look on his face that the decision had been made before Donald was buried. 2 men came through the front door carrying straps. Brian went to meet them. He didn't ask Betty whether they could remove the food or where she wanted anything placed. She stood in the hallway holding the cracked photograph while the old refrigerator was emptied onto the counters. Her jar of peach preserves was set beside the sink. Donald had opened it 3 mornings before he went into the hospital. His spoon had left a little streak of syrup beneath the lid. Betty picked up the jar before someone could throw it away. Brian's wife watched her. "That might not be good anymore." "It's fine. It was already open." "I know it was open." Betty carried the jar to the back room and put it on the floor beside her suitcase. The room didn't even have a windowsill deep enough to hold it. That evening, she ate a ham sandwich on the edge of the plastic-covered mattress. Brian and his wife ate at the kitchen table. Betty could hear their forks touching the plates. They had asked whether she wanted to join them, but only after they were seated. She finished half the sandwich and wrapped the rest in its napkin. At 9, she tried the heat register again. The lever wouldn't move. She found a flat screwdriver in Donald's old kitchen drawer, removed 2 screws, and lifted the cover. A clump of lint had jammed the damper. She cleaned it with a washcloth, worked the lever free, then replaced the cover. Warm air came through within a minute. It was a very small thing, but the room no longer depended on Brian remembering it. Betty took the plastic off the mattress herself. She folded it rather than leaving it in a heap. Then she unpacked one nightgown, her medicine, a clean blouse, and Donald's photograph. The rest stayed in the boxes. She had no intention of teaching the room to recognize her. 3 days later, Brian came home before lunch. Betty was at the kitchen counter checking the property notices from the probate folder. He placed a set of papers beside her elbow and opened the silverware drawer. "I need a pen. There are pens by the telephone. They're gone. Your wife moved them to the blue cup." Brian found the cup and sat across from Betty. He had Donald's habit of pressing his lips together while reading. On Donald, it had meant concentration. On Brian, it often meant he'd decided what another person should do and was preparing to explain it patiently. "What are those?" Betty asked. "Just cleanup papers." She kept reading the tax notice in front of her. The Becker Orchard property had delinquent taxes of $18,000. The deadline was 45 days away. After that, the county could move the property toward a tax sale. Donald had left her the farmhouse, the orchard, and the debt tied to both. She had known taxes were behind. She hadn't known by how much. Brian turned the papers toward her. "This transfers your interest in the orchard parcel." "To whom?" "Becker Produce." "Why?" "So we can combine the acreage." "With what?" "The reservoir side and some company ground." Betty looked at him. "For growing?" Brian tapped his pen once against the table. "There's been interest in the whole stretch." "What kind of interest?" "A development group." She waited. He disliked silence when it wasn't his own. He tapped the pen again. "They're considering a distribution site. It could bring jobs." "On the orchard?" "The orchard isn't producing. It produced when the water line worked. That was years ago." "Not so many." "Mom, half those trees are gone." "A third." "What?" "A third are gone. The north rows were pulled. The lower rows are still standing." He leaned back. "Fine. A third. It doesn't change anything." Betty drew the transfer papers closer, though she didn't touch the pen. The top page called itself a quitclaim deed. She knew enough to understand the plain part. If she signed it, whatever claim she held would pass to Becker Produce. "How much are you offering?" Brian gave a short breath through his nose. "The taxes are $18,000. The roof leaks. The well pump probably needs replacing. You'd be walking away from all that. That isn't an amount. We'd clear the taxes. That's $18,000 for the farmhouse and the orchard. It isn't worth that with the repairs. Then why does the developer need it?" "He doesn't need it. It makes the site cleaner." "What does that mean?" "It means one owner, one closing, no odd parcel cut into the middle." Betty finally looked down at the papers. There were yellow tabs beside 3 signature lines. Brian pushed the blue cup toward her. "I thought this would take some pressure off you. You thought I'd sign it before I asked questions. That isn't fair. You brought me a pen." His expression changed. For a moment, he looked less like the owner of Becker Produce and more like the boy who used to come into the kitchen with a broken latch hidden behind his back. Then the look passed. "You can stay here," he said. "You don't have to worry about where you'll live." "In the back room?" "It's a bedroom. It became a bedroom when you put me in it. We gave you privacy. You moved your fishing cooler out and moved your mother in." Brian stared at the table. Betty hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her anger had become very steady since Donald died. It was the shakier feelings she didn't trust. Brian capped the pen. "I'm trying to keep the company healthy. Did your father agree to this sale?" "He knew we'd have to grow." "That isn't what I asked. He knew the orchard was failing." Betty remembered Donald coming home muddy after late summer evenings, his boots leaving dry flakes beneath the laundry sink. Even during his last year, when climbing the farmhouse steps made him stop for breath, He drove out to Waterworks Road with a wrench box in the truck. She had believed he went to check the old place because he couldn't bear to let it go entirely. She had never asked what he checked. Donald didn't explain each repair, and Betty didn't explain every bill she moved between accounts to keep the household smooth. Their marriage had been built partly on trust and partly on habit. Now she couldn't tell where one had ended and the other had begun. Brian uncapped the pen again. If we miss the developer's schedule, they may walk. You said the orchard wasn't needed. It isn't, but they want the whole footprint. What happens to the reservoir? It stays with the company until closing, and after? It's part of the sale. Betty looked at the quitclaim again. The orchard's parcel number appeared below her name, a long line of digits broken by dashes. She recognized the last four. Donald had written them on seed orders and equipment tags for years. What about Lindsay's bees? Brian frowned. What about them? Her hives are on the south edge. She'll have to move them. Does she know? That's not your concern. It is while I own the ground. The words came out before Betty had considered them. Brian heard the change in them. So did she. He pulled the papers back an inch. You own a tax problem. Then let me understand my tax problem. There's nothing to understand. The farmhouse is barely livable. The irrigation line is dead. And the orchard hasn't paid for itself in years. Have you been inside the farmhouse? I've seen it. That means no. He stood. Kathleen thinks you should sign. Betty's hand tightened around the tax notice. You spoke to her? She understands what this could do to the family. The family seems to be doing quite a lot to me. That's exactly what I mean. Everything becomes personal. My bedroom became personal when you gave it to somebody else. Brian gathered the papers. He left the pen on the table, perhaps by accident. I'll give you until Friday. It's my land. You don't give me a deadline. The developer does. Then the developer can wait for my answer. Brian walked out through the mudroom. The door shut harder than it needed to. Betty remained at the table until she heard his truck leave. Then she took the probate folder to the back room and locked it inside her suitcase. The suitcase lock was cheap, but it was the only lock in the room. She called Kathleen first. Donald's sister answered after the fourth ring. Betty, is something wrong? Brian says you think I should give him the orchard. There was a pause, then the faint sound of a television being turned down. I said you ought to consider what it costs to keep. That isn't the same thing. No, it isn't. Did he tell you about the developer? He said there was an offer coming. Did Donald ever talk to you about selling the reservoir? Kathleen went quiet again. When she answered, her voice had become careful. Donald talked about that land years ago, not recently. What did he say? I don't remember it cleanly enough to repeat over the telephone. Betty looked at the cracked photograph on the dresser. Would you come with me to the orchard? Why? Because I've been told the house is barely livable by a man who hasn't gone inside. Kathleen sighed. When? Tomorrow morning. I have an appointment at 10. Then I'll go before 10. Betty, wait. Don't make a decision because you're angry. I'm not making one. I'm looking at what belongs to me. She ended the call before Kathleen could soften the same warning and offer it back. In the garage, Donald's tools had already been divided. Brian had taken the large rolling chest to the company warehouse. A smaller wooden box remained beneath the workbench, covered with an old fertilizer towel. Betty opened it and found a claw hammer, 2 screwdrivers, adjustable pliers, a folding ruler, and a ring of worn keys. One key had a faded paper tag tied to it with cotton string. Orchard House, Donald had printed in block letters. Betty slipped it off the ring and put it in her pocket. Then she found a flashlight, tested the batteries, and carried the small toolbox to her car. Before going back inside, she stood beside the open trunk and called Lindsay Mitchell. Lindsay answered over the noise of a tractor. Mrs. Becker, it's Betty. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer after the funeral. You stayed long enough. The tractor went quiet. Betty rested one hand on the toolbox. Are your beehives still at the orchard? They are. Brian told me I might have to move them. He doesn't own that orchard. Lindsay said nothing for a moment. No, she said. He doesn't. I'm going out there tomorrow. I need to know whether the farmhouse can be made weather-tight. I can meet you at 8. You don't have to bring anything. I'll bring a ladder. Betty closed the trunk. For the first time since Donald's funeral, someone had answered a request without first reducing it, delaying it, or telling her what would be easier. She went inside, returned to the back room, and packed work gloves, clean socks, and the framed photograph of the farmhouse porch. Then she set the orchard key on top of her shoes, where no one could move it without waking her. She slept lightly and woke before the alarm. Rain tapped against the window for a few minutes, then stopped. By 6, the warm air from the register had made the room stuffy. Betty dressed without turning on the ceiling light. She carried her shoes into the hall and put them on beside the kitchen door. Brian's wife was already there, measuring coffee into the new machine. "You're up early. I'm going out to the orchard." The spoon stopped above the filter. "Does Brian know?" Betty buttoned her coat. "I didn't know I needed to report my errands. I only meant he might want to go with you. He's had plenty of chances." The spoon moved again. "There's rain coming this afternoon. That's why I'm going this morning." Betty opened the refrigerator and found the peach preserves on the bottom shelf behind 3 bottles of salad dressing. She took out the jar, 2 slices of bread, and a small piece of cheese. "There are breakfast sandwiches in the freezer," Brian's wife said. "I see them. You don't need to pack food. I'm not packing for you." The answer was sharper than Betty intended. She put the preserves on the bread and wiped the knife clean. Brian's wife poured water into the coffee machine. She hadn't meant to start a fight. She was uneasy in the house too, though Betty wasn't ready to be generous about that. The woman had moved into another person's kitchen and responded by changing everything quickly. New refrigerator, new shelf paper, new coffee machine. If the rooms looked different, perhaps she wouldn't have to think about who had been asked to shrink. "Brian said there could be mold," she said. "At the farmhouse?" "Yes, he doesn't know that. He's worried about you." Betty wrapped the sandwich in waxed paper. When Brian was worried about his father driving at night, he took the truck keys. When he was worried about the warehouse expenses, he took over the checkbook. Now he's worried about me, and papers appear on the table. That's not the same? No? Donald handed him the keys. She put the sandwich in her handbag and went outside. The morning smelled of wet pavement and fresh mulch. The redbud beside the porch had begun to flower. Betty had planted it when Brian was in grade school, after he brought home a seedling in a paper cup. For 2 summers, he'd carried dishwater out to it, because the hose wouldn't reach. He had once cared whether that tree lived. Betty touched one damp branch, then went to her car. Kathleen was waiting at the end of her own driveway when Betty arrived. She wore a navy raincoat and held a travel cup in each hand. "I brought coffee," she said, getting in. "You said you had an appointment. I moved it to the afternoon." Betty pulled away from the curb. "You didn't have to." "I know." Kathleen placed one cup in the holder between them. Donald's sister had the same broad hands he'd had, with square nails and a pale scar across one thumb. Betty had known her almost as long as she'd known Donald. They'd peeled peaches together, sat through hospital waiting rooms together, and disagreed about nearly every family holiday without staying angry past breakfast. That made Kathleen's caution harder to dismiss. For the first mile, neither woman spoke. Waterworks Road began beyond the edge of Cobden. The pavement narrowed between fields, storage sheds, and old farmhouses set well back from the road. Clouds lay low over the hills. Brown water stood in the ditches from the night's rain. Kathleen held her cup between both hands. "Brian called me last week," she said. "Before the will was read?" "Yes." "What did he want?" "He wanted me to talk to you about staying calm." Betty looked at her. "I'm driving. I can see that. You're the one who told me not to make decisions while I'm angry. I didn't say you were unreasonable. You didn't need to." Kathleen watched the road ahead. She had spent most of her life stepping between Donald and Brian whenever both men decided silence counted as communication. With Donald gone, she had continued the habit without asking whom it protected. "He said the company needed the land deal," Kathleen said. "He told me the orchard didn't matter. He tells different parts to different people. And you call that keeping the family together? I call it trying to keep everybody in the same room." Betty tightened her hands on the wheel. "I'm already in the room he chose for me." Kathleen turned toward the window. The words sat between them until they passed the produce warehouse. 3 Becker produce trucks were parked beside the loading dock. Brian's name appeared on a new white sign near the gate, beneath the company name Donald had painted by hand on the first delivery truck. Betty slowed without meaning to. For years she had brought lunch to that warehouse during packing season. She kept spare shirts for Donald in a cabinet beside the office sink. When Brian started working there full-time, she began bringing enough food for both men. Later, she prepared trays for the seasonal crews, answered the office telephone when the bookkeeper was out, and took deposits to the bank. She'd never been on the payroll. Donald called it helping the family. Betty had called it that too. When Brian began asking for her signature on company forms, he usually came to the kitchen near supper. He would explain the first page, point to the last page, and leave with a plate covered in foil. Betty had been proud that he trusted her. Looking back, she wasn't sure trust was the word. She turned onto the gravel lane leading to the orchard. The gate stood open. Lindsay's pickup was parked beside it, with an extension ladder tied to the rack. Beyond the gate, the land dropped gently toward rows of old peach and apple trees. Some were dead. Their gray branches reached into the damp air without buds. Others showed thin lines of pink along the tips. Grass had grown high between the rows, and blackberry canes crowded the drainage ditch. Betty stopped the car. Kathleen looked across the orchard. "It's worse than when I was here last." "When were you here?" "Donald brought me out 2 summers ago." "Why?" "He needed help carrying something." "What?" "A box of fittings, I think." "I stayed near the truck." Betty turned off the engine. "You never told me. There wasn't anything to tell." "He worked for an hour. Then we went home." "He was still working out here 2 summers ago?" Kathleen nodded. "He came more than once." Betty looked toward the lower rows. She had known Donald drove out to the orchard. She hadn't known Kathleen had gone with him, or that he'd carried tools and fittings. "What was he fixing?" "I don't know, Betty. Did you ask?" "He said he was keeping things from seizing." "What things?" "I just told you." "I don't know." Lindsay walked up beside the car. She wore rubber boots and a canvas jacket darkened at the shoulders by drizzle. Her brown hair was pulled through the back of a cap. "You made good time," she said. Betty got out. "Is the lane always this soft?" "After rain. Stay to the high side when you drive in." Lindsay nodded to Kathleen, then looked at the toolbox in Betty's trunk. Donald's small box. "You recognize it?" "I carried it often enough." Betty lifted it. Brian took the rolling chest. "Of course he did." Kathleen gave Lindsay a warning look. Lindsay didn't apologize. "The farmhouse is locked. I checked the windows from outside. One pane is broken in the pantry, but I covered it last month." "Why?" Betty asked. "My hives are downwind. I come past the house. That doesn't answer why you covered the window." Lindsay took the ladder from her truck. "Donald would have done it if he were here." The farmhouse stood beyond the first row of apple trees. Its white paint had weathered to gray on the west wall. One porch post leaned slightly. A strip of roofing curled above the kitchen, and a dark stain ran beneath the gutter. The building looked tired, but it didn't look finished. Betty climbed the 3 porch steps. The second one shifted under her shoe. "Left side," Lindsay said. "The right edge is soft." Betty moved her foot. Kathleen stayed below. "Be careful." "I am being careful." She took the tag key from her pocket and fitted it into the front lock. It entered but wouldn't turn. Brian's voice came back to her. "Barely livable. Mold. Tax problem." She tried the key again. "Lift the door a little," Lindsay said. The frame settled. Betty put her shoulder beneath the knob, lifted, and turned the key. The lock opened. There was the first small answer. She still had a key to something, and it still worked. The front room smelled of dust, old wood and damp plaster. Sheets covered a sofas and 2 chairs. Donald's green rain hat hung on a peg beside the door. Betty stopped when she saw it. He had worn that hat for orchard work because water ran off the wide brim instead of down his collar. She had teased him about it for years. He said a hat didn't need to improve a face if the face was already married. Lindsay carried the ladder inside and set it against the wall. "He left it here last spring," she said. "You were with him?" "Most Saturdays once the packing season eased up." "What did he do out here?" "Pruned what he could. Checked the lower line. Cleaned around the tank." "Did Brian know?" "He knew I came." "I don't know what Donald told him." Betty touched the brim of the hat. The fabric had stiffened where mud dried along one edge. She had spent that same spring arranging Donald's heart medicine, calling the pharmacy, and arguing with him about salt. She thought she knew where he went because she knew when he left and when he came home. That wasn't the same as knowing. Lindsay opened the curtains. Gray light spread across the room, showing a water stain in one corner of the ceiling. "The roof leak is mostly over the kitchen," she said. "This room stayed dry." Kathleen came inside and tested the floor with each step. "I don't smell mold. It's cold enough to hide some of it," Lindsay said, "but I haven't seen any on the walls." They went into the kitchen. Two metal buckets stood beneath brown marks in the ceiling. One held 3 inches of rainwater. The cabinets were solid oak, built by Donald before Brian was born. A mouse had chewed one corner of a dish towel. Betty opened the cabinet beneath the sink. The pipes were dry. "Is the well on?" she asked. "Power's shut off," Lindsay said. Donald drained the house before winter. So Brian knew the water wasn't running. He should have known. He said the pump probably needed replacing. Lindsay's mouth flattened. Probably is doing work for him. Kathleen walked to the back door. "The porch is pulling away." "That can be braced," Betty said. She didn't know whether it could. Donald had handled structural repairs. Betty handled paint, fixtures, accounts, meals, schedules, and the 100 daily failures that never reached him because she solved them first. Between them, things worked. She had mistaken that partnership for knowledge she possessed alone. In the small bedroom, the ceiling was dry. The iron bed frame stood against the wall without a mattress. A walnut dresser remained in the corner. Betty opened its top drawer and found a folded work shirt. It was Donald's. She lifted it to her face. It smelled only of the drawer. Kathleen stood in the doorway. "He kept clothes here?" "One shirt isn't clothes." "No." "But you didn't know." Betty folded it again. "No." Kathleen stepped into the room. "Donald should have told you what he was doing. I should have asked. You trusted him. I also made it easy for every man in this family to tell me only the part he needed me to handle." Kathleen lowered her eyes. Betty put the shirt back in the drawer. She didn't close it. They checked the second bedroom, the bathroom, and the rear porch. The windows needed glazing. The back door needed a new threshold. There was animal nesting in the attic, though Lindsay thought it was squirrels, not raccoons. Outside, Lindsay raised the ladder and inspected the roof from the top rung. "A tarp will hold until we can replace that section," she called down. "The rafters don't look soft." "How long to make 2 rooms usable?" Betty asked. Kathleen looked at her. Lindsay climbed down. "If the electric comes on and the well runs, a week. Maybe less. And if the pump is bad, longer, and it'll cost." Betty walked to the porch rail. From there she could see the orchard slope toward the reservoir tract, though the reservoir itself lay behind a rise and a line of company fencing. "Donald always said the house was sound," she said. "It is sound," Lindsay replied. "Neglected isn't the same as ruined." Betty opened her handbag and took out the tax notice. She showed Lindsay the amount and the deadline. Lindsay read it twice. "That's close." "Yes." "Does Brian know you have this?" "He brought me the folder. He expects the taxes to make the choice for you." Betty folded the notice along its existing crease. For years she had believed belonging meant being needed. She knew everyone's coffee, everyone's appointments, where the extra keys were kept, which bill could wait 3 days, and how to get Donald and Brian speaking again after an argument. She had made herself useful in every room of the family house. Now she saw the weakness in it. People could accept years of care without accepting her authority over anything. Her phone rang. Brian's name filled the screen. She let it ring once more, then answered. "Where are you?" he asked. "At the orchard." "You went out there alone?" "No." "Who's with you?" "People I invited." There was a brief silence. "Mom, don't start doing work on that place. I'm inspecting my property. You could get hurt. I could also get an estimate. You're making this harder than it needs to be." Betty looked at the open front door, Donald's hat inside, and Lindsay's ladder resting against the porch. "No," she said. "I'm finding out how hard it actually is." She ended the call, opened Donald's toolbox, and handed Lindsay the folding ruler. Lindsay opened it, measured the kitchen ceiling, then went outside to measure the damaged roof above it. Betty wrote each figure on the back of an envelope. The old roof patch was roughly 6 feet wide and 9 feet long. The porch needed 2 support posts. 3 windows required new glass, and the pantry window could be repaired with the pane Lindsay had stored in her barn. "You stored a window for this house?" Betty asked. "It came out of my shed. Close enough in size?" "Close enough isn't a measurement." Lindsay smiled and took the ruler back outside. Kathleen stood at the kitchen counter, watching Betty add items to the envelope. "You're serious about staying here?" "I'm serious about knowing whether I can." "Those aren't the same thing. They weren't when we arrived." Kathleen opened one of the cabinets. Inside were 4 white dinner plates with green rings around the edges. Betty and Donald had used them in the farmhouse when Brian was young and summer work ran past dark. She remembered washing those plates in a metal basin because the sink drain had clogged with peach skins. What happens if it takes most of your savings? Kathleen asked. I don't know yet. And if you fix it, then decide to sell, then I'll be selling a house with a roof. To Brian? Betty stopped writing. Why do you keep bringing me back to what Brian needs? Because Donald is gone, and Brian is what we have left. He isn't a canned ham in a storm cellar, Kathleen. We don't have to preserve him at any cost. I'm trying to preserve a relationship, then ask him what he plans to preserve. Kathleen closed the cabinet. She didn't answer because she knew Betty had asked the right person the question. That person wasn't standing in the kitchen. Lindsay returned with wet shoulders and a better measurement. She took out her phone and called a roofer she knew in Alto Pass. He couldn't come that day, but he could send 2 workers the next morning to put down a proper temporary cover and inspect the decking. They'll want paying when they finish, Lindsay said. How much? He said no more than $600 unless they find rot. Betty wrote it down. Kathleen looked at the stained ceiling. You should get another estimate. For the permanent roof, yes. Not for keeping tonight's rain out. You're staying tonight? No. I'm stopping the next rain from making the problem larger. That distinction mattered to Betty. She wasn't ready to call the farmhouse home. She was ready to act like its owner. The electric meter was mounted on the outside wall beneath a small metal hood. Lindsay brushed away a spider web and read the number to Betty. Betty called the utility company from the porch. The woman on the telephone asked for the service address, the meter number, and proof that Betty owned the property. My name is on the recorded transfer from the estate, Betty said. I can check the county listing if you'll hold, Betty held. Brian had made her feel as though the orchard existed only because he hadn't yet removed it from her hands. Hearing a stranger confirm her name on a public record shouldn't have mattered. It did. The utility woman returned. I found it. There's an old balance of $63 and a reconnection charge. Put both on my card. The earliest service visit is tomorrow afternoon. I'll be there. After the call, Betty wrote electric tomorrow on the envelope. What about the well? Kathleen asked. We test it after the power's on. And if it doesn't work, then we learn what doesn't work. Kathleen checked her watch. I need to go. I can drive you. I'll call a friend. You're busy. The correction was small, but Betty heard it. Kathleen hadn't said stubborn, upset, or making trouble. She'd said busy. Before leaving, Kathleen paused beside Donald's rain hat. He was protective of this place, she said. In what way? I can't give you details I don't remember. Then give me what you do remember. Kathleen touched the hat's chin cord. When the company papers changed years ago, Donald said the orchard had to stand on its own. I thought he meant financially. Maybe he did. What company papers? I don't know. Something involving the reservoir land. There were papers all over the dining table for a week. Was Brian involved? He was young. Donald was still running everything. Betty waited, but Kathleen had reached the edge of what she could recall without guessing. I'll come back tomorrow, Kathleen said. For the electric? For you. She left by the front path. Lindsay watched her go. She knows something. She remembers something, Betty said. That isn't always the same. They spent the next hour checking doors and clearing the kitchen floor. Betty swept mouse droppings into a dustpan, while Lindsay removed the damaged pantry glass. The work warmed them. By the time the rain began again, the open pane was covered with plywood. The buckets had been emptied, and a plastic sheet had been fastened beneath the worst ceiling stain. Water struck the roof. A slow drip began over the stove, but the front room stayed dry. Lindsay stood in the doorway between the rooms. You could make this comfortable. Comfortable costs more than dry. Dry comes first. Betty looked at the sofa beneath its sheet. Can you help me lift that? They pulled the sheet away. The upholstery smelled stale, but showed no water damage. They moved the sofa closer to the front window and rolled up the damp rug beneath it. A brass floor lamp stood behind one chair. Betty plugged it into an outlet before remembering the power was off. Lindsay laughed softly. What? Nothing? I've done that in my own barn. Betty left the lamp where it was. At noon, they ate in Lindsay's pickup because the rain came sideways across the porch. Lindsay had brought 2 hard-boiled eggs, crackers, and an apple. Betty divided her cheese and preserves sandwich. Donald ate those preserves on everything, Lindsay said. He said they improved bad bread. He put them on sausage biscuits. That was to annoy me. It worked. Betty looked through the windshield toward the orchard. How often was he here last year? Until he got sick, 2 or 3 times a month. He told me he was checking company storage. Sometimes he stopped there first. Did he ask you not to tell me? No, I assumed you knew. That answer hurt more than a secret would have. There had been no conspiracy. Donald lived in a world where the orchard, the company land, and its pipes made sense to him. Lindsay worked in that world. Betty had accepted the household edge of it and told herself that was enough. What did you do together? She asked. Pruning, mostly. We cleared brush from the lower line in early spring. He checked fittings near the header tank. Did water run? Not while I was there. Did he say why? He said Brian had equipment near the reservoir access, and he'd deal with it later. What equipment? I never saw it. Betty folded the wax paper into a neat square. Where is the header tank? Lindsay pointed through the windshield. Past the lower apple rows. You can't see it from here. Show me after the rain eases. The rain continued until nearly 2. They drove back to town without reaching the tank. At the family house, Brian's truck was in the driveway. Betty carried Donald's toolbox through the front door. He met her in the kitchen. You had the power turned on. The utility company works quickly. I got an email because Becker Produce used to hold the account. Used to. Brian looked at the muddy toolbox. Are you planning to live out there? I'm planning to test the well. You can't live in that house. That depends on the well, the roof, and me. It also depends on the taxes. I know the amount. Then you know this isn't practical. Betty set the toolbox on a sheet of newspaper. What company papers changed when you were young? Brian blinked. What? Something involving the reservoir land. I have no idea. Your aunt remembers papers on the dining table. Aunt Kathleen remembers half of every conversation and adds the other half later. She didn't add anything. That was the problem. Brian opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. The reservoir has belonged to Becker Produce for decades. I didn't ask who owns it. What are you asking? I'm trying to understand why your father kept working on orchard pipes when you say there was no water. Brian twisted the cap off the bottle. Habit. Dad kept broken equipment everywhere. He carried new fittings out there. Then asked Lindsay. She followed him around that orchard like it was still making money. I did ask her. That made him pause. Betty saw it clearly. Brian didn't know what Lindsay had told her, and he didn't know how much his father had done. His certainty was not knowledge. It was convenience. He didn't have water access, Brian said. Then why block the reservoir road with equipment? I didn't block anything. You told Lindsay equipment was there. No, Dad told her. I don't know what he meant. You just said she followed him around. I assumed. Betty picked up the toolbox. So did I. She took it to the back room and packed another blouse. The following morning, she met the roofing workers at the orchard. They found damp sheathing beneath one torn section, but no rot in the rafters. The temporary cover cost $580. Betty paid it from her retirement account and kept the receipt. By afternoon, the rain had moved east. A utility truck arrived, and power returned to the farmhouse with a click from the meter. Inside, the old refrigerator began to hum. The brass floor lamp came on because Betty had left its switch turned. The yellow light filled the front room. Lindsay stood by the well controls while Betty opened the kitchen tap. At first, nothing happened. Then the pipes knocked inside the wall. Brown water coughed into the sink, stopped, and came again. The pump runs, Lindsay called. They let the water flow until it cleared. Lindsay used a test strip from her farm kit, then filled a sample bottle for a proper test in town. Brian had been wrong about the pump. Betty washed her hands under cold running water and dried them on paper towels. One deliberate expense had given her a dry roof, electricity, and proof that the house could function. It also gave her a choice she could no longer pretend she didn't have. She drove back to Maple Street before supper. Brian was still at work. His wife stood in the hall as Betty carried the first suitcase from the back room. Where are you going? To the farmhouse. Tonight? Yes. You can't sleep there alone. I can, and I won't be alone. Lindsay's staying in the front room. That arrangement had been Lindsay's suggestion, though only for the first night. What should I tell Brian? Tell him I moved. Betty carried the suitcase to her car. She returned for the second box, Donald's photograph, her medicine, and the jar of preserves. She left the mattress bare, except for the folded plastic at its foot. On her final trip through the kitchen, she took the blue cup of pens. It had been hers before the kitchen changed. The first night at the farmhouse was cold. The heating system worked in the front rooms but rattled in the hallway. Lindsay slept on the sofa beneath two quilts. Betty used the small bedroom after they fitted a borrowed mattress onto the iron bed. At dawn, they drank coffee on the porch. A low mechanical knock came from beyond the orchard. Lindsay lowered her cup. "Did you hear that?" Once. They heard it again. They pulled on their boots and walked past the lower apple rows. Wet grass brushed Betty's calves. At the end of the row stood the old header tank on a concrete base. A dead irrigation pipe entered beneath it. Bolts, leaves, and packed dirt filled the inspection box beside the line. Lindsay knelt and removed the loose debris. "There shouldn't be pressure here," she said. Betty fetched an iron rod from the nearby shed. Together they cleared the packed outlet and lifted a clump of roots from around the pipe. Something moved inside the line. The round gauge fixed above the inspection box trembled. Its needle rose a fraction, dropped, then rose again. Lindsay wiped mud from the glass. "That line isn't dead." Betty crouched beside her. Beneath the gauge, nearly hidden by rust, a stamped metal plate carried the orchard's parcel number. Betty took the tax notice from her coat pocket and compared the numbers. They matched. "Why would the parcel number be on a pressure gauge?" Lindsay asked. "I don't know. Donald didn't label things for decoration." Betty rubbed the edge of the plate with her thumb. Mud had filled the stamped grooves. The plate looked older than the gauge, as if it had been transferred from an earlier piece of equipment. The needle moved again. Not enough to show useful pressure, but enough to prove something was reaching the line. Lindsay opened the inspection box farther. A narrow pipe continued downhill beneath the grass, then turned toward the orchard. The larger supply pipe ran uphill, toward the rise and the reservoir beyond it. "This line was disconnected," Lindsay said. "Where?" "Not here." "Could rainwater cause pressure?" "Not like that." "Could the well?" "It's on the wrong side of the system." Betty stood and looked up the slope. From the header tank, the shortest route to the reservoir crossed Becker produce land. "Can we follow the pipe?" "Partway. The company fence cuts across it." "Since when?" "Brian put up that section last fall." They walked uphill through tall grass. Lindsay found two metal cleanout caps, both nearly buried. The line passed beneath a shallow ditch and continued toward a row of cedar posts. A chain-link fence rose beyond the posts. A company sign warned against unauthorized entry. On the other side, an overgrown service lane curved toward the reservoir. The pipe disappeared beneath the fence. Betty gripped the wire and looked through it. "Is there a valve up there?" "There was," Lindsay said. "Donald called it the orchard valve. You've seen it from a distance." "I never operated it." "Who did?" "Donald. And after he got sick?" "Nobody, as far as I know." A Becker produce padlock secured the gate 50 yards to their right. Betty took out her phone and photographed the fence, the sign, the buried pipe, and the gauge. Then she photographed the stamped plate beside the parcel number on her tax notice. "What are you going to do?" Lindsay asked. "Find out why those numbers match." They returned to the farmhouse. Kathleen's car was parked beside the porch. She stood in the kitchen holding the blue cup. "You took the pens. They were mine." "I know. I was wondering why they were here, because I'm here." Kathleen set down the cup. She looked tired, as though she had spent the previous night arguing with herself, and neither side had slept. "I brought towels," she said. "And sheets." "They're in the car?" "Yes." "Good. We need both." Kathleen's shoulders eased slightly. Betty hadn't thanked her with a speech or made her earn entry. She had simply accepted useful help. Lindsay came in behind them and placed the muddy tax notice on the counter. "We found a parcel number on the irrigation gauge." Kathleen put on her reading glasses. "Is that unusual?" "It's the orchard's number," Betty said. "The pipe runs under the company fence toward the reservoir. Donald installed that line years ago." "What do you know about it?" "Only that the orchard used reservoir water before the new well went in. The well is for the house. I thought it served everything. It couldn't water these acres." Kathleen studied the notice again. "When Donald moved the reservoir tract into the company, there was some argument about the orchard. With whom? The accountant, maybe, or the man handling the papers. Donald said he wouldn't leave the orchard dry." Betty kept her voice even. "You didn't remember that yesterday?" "I remembered the argument. I didn't know it mattered." "Were you there?" "At the house. I wasn't sitting at the table every minute." "Did you sign anything?" Kathleen removed her glasses. "I signed as a witness on something." "Betty, it was a long time ago." "What did the paper say?" "I didn't read every page." Donald pointed to the line. "I signed." Betty felt irritation rise, then recognized the unfairness in it. She had signed papers the same way. Kathleen's admission held up an old family habit neither woman could criticize cleanly. Where would the original be? Betty asked. Company files, maybe. Brian controls those. The county would have the land transfer, Lindsay said. Betty called the county recorder's office. The woman who answered asked for the parcel number and the approximate year of the transaction. Kathleen counted backward from Brian's early years at the warehouse and gave her best guess. Come in before 4, the woman said. The older records aren't all scanned. Betty changed into clean shoes. Lindsay stayed to check the pipe route and move her hives away from the muddy lane. Kathleen drove because Betty wanted to study the photographs on the way. The county building stood beside a parking lot, patched in 3 shades of asphalt. Inside, the recorder's office had fluorescent lights, a waist-high counter, and shelves of thick index books. The clerk copied the orchard parcel number onto a request slip. You're looking for a transfer involving this parcel? The reservoir parcel, Betty said. I don't have that number. The orchard may be mentioned in the transfer. Grantor, Donald Becker. Grantee was Becker Produce, Kathleen added. The clerk searched a computer, then checked an index book. She disappeared through a door and returned carrying a narrow file. There's only one separately recorded water document tied to the orchard number. Betty looked at Lindsay's photograph on her phone, then at the file. May I see it? That's what it's here for. The clerk placed the pages beneath a clear protective sheet. The first was a certified record from the transfer of the reservoir tract. The language was dense in places, but a paragraph near the middle had been marked with a red pencil line years earlier. The owner transferring the reservoir land had reserved a seasonal right to draw water for the orchard parcel. The right included access to maintain the intake, valve, line, and related equipment. It continued with the orchard property, even if the reservoir tract or company changed hands. Betty read the paragraph 3 times. Reserved by whom? She asked. Donald Becker, according to the document. For himself? For the orchard parcel, the clerk said. The right is attached to that land. Kathleen leaned closer. So, Betty has it? The clerk gave the careful expression of someone who knew where her job ended. I can tell you what the recorded page says. I can't interpret your rights or tell you whether the system still meets these descriptions. Why not? Because the old bearings would need to be matched on the ground, and I don't know the condition of the intake. Betty pointed to one line. What does perpetual mean here? It means the document doesn't give the right an end date. And seasonal, the draw is limited to the irrigation season described in the next section. Betty read that section. The allowed months covered spring through early fall. There were limits on flow and rules about maintenance. Nothing promised free water or free repairs. The orchard owner had to maintain the orchard equipment and avoid interfering with the reservoir's business use. It wasn't a gift that solved every problem. It was a working right, and work came with it. Can the reservoir owner lock the orchard owner out? Betty asked. I can't answer a dispute, the clerk said. The document does describe access. She turned the page. A simple drawing showed a route from the orchard's header tank across the reservoir tract to a valve near the southern bank. The route looked like the pipe Lindsay had followed. At the bottom was Donald's signature. Beside it appeared Kathleen's. Kathleen sat back. That's mine. You witnessed this? Betty asked. I told you I signed something. You witnessed him reserve water for the orchard. I didn't understand that was what the whole paper did. Betty looked again at Donald's name. He had signed firmly, the final stroke rising beneath the date. The document had been recorded 27 years before his death. For all those years, Donald had known the orchard did not depend on the company's goodwill for water. He had gone out with fittings and tools because he meant to keep that right in use. Betty ordered 2 certified copies. The clerk stamped them, attached raised seals, and charged her for each page. Has anyone else requested this file recently? Betty asked. I can't give you names from other requests. The records are public. Has it been out? The clerk checked the tracking card inside the cover. It was pulled once last month. Kathleen looked at Betty. Could have been the developer, she said, after they stepped into the hallway. Or Brian. If Brian saw that paragraph, why would he tell you there was no access? Maybe he didn't read it. Maybe he did. Betty placed one certified copy in her handbag and gave the other to Kathleen. Keep this at your house. Kathleen accepted it. You don't trust Brian not to take yours? I don't trust the back room. On the drive home, Kathleen kept both hands on the wheel. What will you do now? Ask for access to the valve. And if Brian says no? Then he'll have to say no, knowing I have this. You could still sell, yes. Kathleen glanced at her. Will you? I haven't seen water reach the tank. I don't know what the right is worth or what repairs would cost. I know only that the orchard wasn't left helpless. That knowledge changed the tax notice in Betty's handbag. $18,000 was still due. The roof still needed permanent work. The trees were still neglected. But the land wasn't simply a burden Donald had dropped into her lap. It carried a protected connection he had chosen to keep. Back at the farmhouse, Lindsay had cleared grass from the pipe root and marked each visible fitting with an orange flag. Betty showed her the certified copy. Lindsay read the marked paragraph and walked straight to the drawing. That's the service lane. Can we operate the valve? If it still works. We need to inspect the intake first. The document says I have access. It also says you're responsible for the orchard side. If the line breaks when we open it, that's your repair. How much line is underground? More than I want to guess. Betty looked across the rows. Every gain seemed to expose another expense. Her phone rang. Brian again. She answered on the porch. Aunt Kathleen says you went to the recorder's office, he said. Kathleen stared at the certified copy in her hands. She didn't call him, Betty said. Brian ignored that. You're digging through old company papers without understanding them. They're county records. That reservation hasn't been used in years. You told me it didn't exist. I said you didn't have water access. The recorded paper says I do. It says Dad reserved something under an old arrangement. The company owns the reservoir, and I own the orchard. Mom, don't turn this into a fight. Unlock the service gate tomorrow morning. No. The answer came quickly, without any softness around it. Betty stepped off the porch. Why? Because it's an active company site. Lindsay says the lane hasn't been used in months. She doesn't work for me. The record gives the orchard owner access for maintenance. I'm not letting you and Lindsay wander around a reservoir because you found an old page. Then meet us there. I have a business to run, and I have an orchard to inspect. Brian lowered his voice. If you damage company property, you'll be responsible. If the orchard line is damaged, I'll be responsible for that. You don't know where one ends and the other begins. No, Betty said. That's why I'm asking you to open the gate. He was silent long enough for her to hear someone speaking near him. The developer's people will be on the track tomorrow, he said. Stay away. The call ended. Lindsay had heard enough to understand. He knows the document matters, she said. He knows the gate matters. Betty took a sheet of farmhouse stationery from a kitchen drawer. At the table, she wrote a dated request for access to inspect and maintain the orchard intake. She cited the recorded document number exactly as it appeared on the certified copy. Then she photographed the letter and sent it to Brian by email. She also wrote, in one plain sentence, that she would not sign the quitclaim. By evening, a new chain had been wrapped through the company gate. A second padlock hung beside the first, bright silver against the older rusted metal. On the far side of the fence, 2 survey flags had appeared along the developer's proposed road. Betty counted 7 flags before the light faded. 4 followed the service lane. 3 stood near the company fence, close to the buried orchard pipe. Lindsay walked the fence line while Betty photographed each flag from her side. Small plastic ribbons carried handwritten marks. One said, Road Center. Another said, Test Pit. If they dig there, they could hit the line, Lindsay said. They don't own the orchard. They don't have to enter the orchard to damage what feeds it. Betty sent 2 photographs to Brian with another written request. She asked him to confirm that no digging would occur along the recorded access route until the orchard line was inspected. He didn't answer that evening. The permanent roof estimate arrived the next morning. It was more than Betty expected. The damaged section could be repaired, but the shingles on the rest of the house were near the end of their life. The roofer offered 2 prices, one for the urgent section and another for replacing everything before winter. Betty placed both estimates beside the tax notice. Lindsay came in carrying a box of plumbing fittings. You bought those? They were in my barn. Were they Donald's? Some. The rest are mine. Betty separated them into 2 piles. I'll pay for yours. We don't know what we need yet. When we know, I'll pay. Lindsay understood the boundary. Help was welcome. Uncounted obligation was not. They returned to the header tank with brushes, penetrating oil, and Donald's small toolbox. The gauge needle rested just above 0. Lindsay scraped dirt away from the concrete base. A rectangular metal door appeared beneath the vines. Its hinges had rusted, and the latch wouldn't move. "What's inside?" Betty asked. "Controls, I think." "Did you ever open it with Donald?" "No. He told me not to force it." Betty found a small wire brush in the toolbox and cleaned the latch. She soaked it with oil, waited, then tapped around the edges with the wooden handle of a screwdriver. Lindsay crouched beside her. "Want me to try?" "Not yet." Betty tapped again, worked the latch back and forth, and felt it shift. Donald had taught Brian to use force when a machine resisted. Betty had spent years watching both men break screws, bolts, and one expensive mower housing because patience felt too much like hesitation. She waited another minute. The latch turned. Inside the compartment were two old valves, a pressure switch, and a shelf made from a narrow board. A mouse nest filled one corner. Beside it lay a green maintenance notebook sealed inside a cloudy freezer bag. Betty took it out carefully. The cover had curled with damp, but the pages were dry. Donald had written the orchard parcel number at the top. Below it, he listed dates, valve readings, replaced fittings, and hours of seasonal flow. The entries began many years earlier and continued almost to the end of his life. "Here," Lindsay said. She pointed to an entry from the previous spring. "South intake, open. Line, slow. Cleared roots at lower box. Flow, restored." Another entry, written later that summer, recorded a gauge reading and the number of hours the orchard drew water. "He used it last year," Betty said. "Looks like every year." Betty turned through the pages. Some seasons had only 3 entries, others filled several pages. Donald recorded repairs to the intake screen, a valve stem, and 2 sections of buried pipe. He noted when reservoir levels were low and reduced the draw without being asked. The right hadn't sat forgotten in a county file. Donald had exercised it and maintained it. Near the back, Betty found Lindsay's name beside a list of pruning work. "You helped him with the lower line that day." Lindsay read the entry. "I remember clearing brush. I didn't know he opened the intake after I left. Why wouldn't he tell you? He was private about water. He was private about everything he thought should simply work." Betty turned the next page. In Donald's block writing, beneath a list of parts, were 7 words. "Keep orchard working. Separate for Betty." She read them once, then closed the book over her finger. Lindsay looked away toward the rows. Betty had wanted to know why Donald kept returning. Now she had an answer that brought no comfort without blame attached. He had planned for the orchard to stand apart, but he hadn't trusted her with the plan while he was alive. He had protected a future for her and left her unprepared to recognize it. "Do you want a minute?" Lindsay asked. "No. I want to know whether the line holds." They removed the mouse nest and checked the visible fittings. One rubber seal had split. Lindsay replaced it with a new one from her box while Betty cleaned the valve threads. The work took most of the morning. By noon, they had freed the tank's lower control valve and opened a drain on the orchard side. The gauge needle trembled when Lindsay turned it. A thin stream of rusty water ran into the drainage ditch. "That's what was trapped in the line," Lindsay said. "It doesn't prove the intake is open. Does it prove the pipe reaches this far without a complete break? It proves part of it does. It was useful, but incomplete. To test the whole route, they still needed access beyond the fence. An engine sounded on the lane. Brian's truck stopped near the lower rows. He got out wearing work boots and a company jacket. He looked at the tools spread beside the header tank, then at the green notebook in Betty's hand. "What are you doing?" "Maintenance." "You don't know that system. I know more than I did yesterday." He came closer. "Where did you find that?" "In the service compartment. That could be company property. It has the orchard parcel number on the cover. Dad kept company records everywhere." Betty opened the notebook to the most recent flow entries. He recorded orchard water last year. Brian read without taking the book. His face changed slightly. He had expected old parts, not a recent history. That doesn't mean he had a permanent right. The county record does. The company's attorney will have to review it. Yesterday it didn't exist. Today it needs review. I never said it didn't exist. You said I had no access. You don't have unrestricted access. That's different. Betty looked toward the fence. "Will the test pits interfere with the pipe?" Brian followed her gaze. "They're doing soil work. Along the recorded route, it's company land. The route crosses company land." "Mom, you're reading one paragraph and acting like you control the reservoir. I'm asking whether digging will damage the orchard line. I'll ask the site people. When? When I can. The flags went up yesterday. and nobody has dug anything. Lindsay stood beside the open compartment. Donald's drawing puts the intake line under the second test flag, she said. Brian turned to her. This is between my mother and the company. The pipe doesn't know that. You're here because you've had free space for your hives. I have a lease, an expired one. Lindsay's jaw tightened. Betty hadn't known the written beehive lease had expired. Donald had renewed it with Lindsay each spring, usually for a small payment and help during bloom. If the last term had ended, Lindsay was now on Betty's land by informal permission. When did it expire? Betty asked. End of last season, Lindsay said. Donald said we'd renew in spring. Brian looked at Betty. There. Another problem you didn't know you owned. It landed because it was true. Betty held the notebook against her coat. Lindsay has my permission to keep the hives here while we write a new agreement. You should talk to someone before signing anything. I just did talk to someone. I talked to Lindsay. Brian took a folded paper from his jacket pocket. I brought you this. It was a formal response from Becker Produce. The company denied immediate access because of ongoing site evaluation and safety concerns. It invited Betty to submit a proposed inspection date, proof of insurance, and the names of anyone entering. You wrote this after I asked for tomorrow morning, Betty said. The company has procedures. Did it have procedures when your father went through the gate? He owned the company and the orchard. Brian pointed at the maintenance notebook. If Dad ran water without recording it through company operations, that creates questions. He recorded it here, in his personal book. The right belongs to the orchard. Why would your company need a second record? Because the company maintains the reservoir. Then show me its records. Brian's mouth tightened. I'll have them reviewed. Betty handed the denial back. You can keep that. I have the email. He didn't take it. Don't enter through the gate, he said. If Lindsay cuts that chain, I'll have her removed. I'm not cutting anything, Lindsay said. Brian looked at the open compartment again. He had noticed the cleared line, the new fitting, and the water in the ditch. Whatever he had believed about the orchard that morning, he now knew his mother was not simply waiting for taxes to defeat her. The quit-claim offer is open until the end of the week, he said. After that, the developer won't cover the taxes. The county deadline is later. The developer is moving its closing schedule. They want every related parcel settled before the next review. So, this is your deadline, not the county's. It's the last chance for you to walk away clean. Betty folded the paper and put it in her pocket. I'm not walking away before I see that valve. Brian returned to his truck. Instead of leaving by the lane, he drove toward the company gate. He got out there, photographed the new chain, and checked both locks. Lindsay watched him. He thinks we'll go around, can we? Not without crossing company land. Then we won't. Betty returned to the farmhouse and spread the certified record, the maintenance notebook, and the old drawing across the kitchen table. She called the county tax office and confirmed the exact amount due and the final payment date. 38 days remained. Then she called the number on Brian's written response. He answered from the company office. I'm proposing an inspection for Monday morning, she said. You can be present. Lindsay will be with me. That's too soon. Your test pits are sooner. I need to check schedules. Send me a time by tomorrow. You don't get to set company operations. I get to request access under the recorded agreement. He was silent. Betty looked at Donald's 7 words in the open notebook. I also want copies of any reservoir maintenance record that mentions the orchard valve. Those records belong to Becker Produce. Then let them show whether you're right. After the call, Lindsay brought the expired beehive lease from her truck. Betty read every page before signing a temporary renewal. It gave Lindsay lawful use of the south edge through the bloom season and required her to help monitor the trees. The arrangement no longer depended on Donald's handshake or Brian's tolerance. At dusk, a company excavator arrived beyond the fence. It stopped beside the service lane, directly uphill from the orchard pipe. Its bucket lowered into the grass, but did not dig. A man in the cab took photographs of Betty and Lindsay standing beside the header tank. Then Brian's email arrived. He granted a 1-hour supervised inspection on Monday, but only after Betty accepted responsibility for any damage caused by opening the orchard valve. Betty replied that she would accept responsibility only for work performed on the orchard equipment. She would not accept responsibility for existing damage or for company machinery, the reservoir bank, or the service road. Brian answered near midnight. Fine. 1 hour. On Monday morning, Betty met Lindsay at the gate before 8. Betty carried the certified record in a plastic folder. Lindsay brought hand tools, a shovel, and a small pump for clearing standing water. Brian arrived 6 minutes late. He unlocked both padlocks but left the chains hanging from the gate. "You have until 9, he said. "Did you bring the reservoir records?" Betty asked. "They're being reviewed, so no." "Mom, don't start." She handed him a copy of her written conditions. "What's this?" "What I agreed to." He read the first lines. "You don't need to make everything formal. You did." He folded the page and put it in his jacket. The service lane climbed gently toward the reservoir. On one side stood thick brush and young maples. On the other, the ground had been cleared for soil testing. The excavator sat near the flags, its bucket resting less than 20 feet from the buried pipe root. Betty stopped to photograph it. Brian looked at his watch. "The valve is ahead. I'm documenting the route. You're using your own time." Lindsay gave him a look but kept walking. The reservoir appeared beyond the rise, a wide gray sheet of water held between wooded banks. Betty had seen it from the road before, but she had never stood beside it. Donald had brought Brian here often. He had never asked Betty to come. A concrete intake structure stood near the southern bank. Leaves, silt, and broken branches had collected around its metal screen. A pipe led from the structure toward a square valve box beside the service lane. Lindsay opened Donald's maintenance notebook. "The measurements begin from a marker near the bank." "There," Betty said. A low concrete post stood beneath a thorny vine. Its top carried a rusted metal cap. Brian glanced at it. That could be anything. "It's in the drawing. The drawing isn't a survey." "No, but the post is still here." They continued to the valve box. Its lid had settled beneath several inches of soil. Brian pointed. "That's as far as you need to inspect. We need to see the valve. You've seen where it is. The right includes maintenance. I'm allowing inspection." Betty looked at the email on her phone. It says, "Inspection of the intake and orchard valve." You chose the wording. Brian looked toward the excavator, then stepped back. "Don't damage the box." Lindsay cut roots from around the lid. Betty loosened packed soil with a narrow hand tool. They worked carefully, clearing one side, then the other. The lid lifted after 15 minutes. Brown water filled the lower half of the box. The valve wheel rose above it, coated with rust but intact. A smaller locking bar had been fitted across the wheel. Betty crouched beside it. "Who installed that?" Brian looked down. "Probably Dad?" "It's newer than the wheel," Lindsay said. "You can tell that from rust. I can tell from the bolts." Betty photographed the bar. "Do you have the key?" "No. Who does?" "I don't know. You control the reservoir. That doesn't mean I carry every old key." Lindsay set up the small pump and lowered its hose into the box. Brian checked his watch again. "You have 35 minutes. As the water level fell, the lower valve body came into view. The casting carried an arrow pointing toward the orchard. Beneath it was the same parcel number stamped on the gauge. Brian saw it too. He said nothing. The pipe was connected. The intake existed. The equipment carried the orchard's number on both ends of the route. It still didn't prove the line would deliver water, but it removed Brian's easiest claim that Donald's paper referred to an abandoned arrangement with no physical system. Lindsay knelt beside the intake screen. "This needs clearing before anyone opens that valve." A mat of roots and leaves had pressed against the lower section. Lindsay pulled loose branches away. Betty used the shovel to lift a heavy clump from the edge. "Leave it," Lindsay said. "I'll get that. I have it." The clump came free suddenly. The shovel handle jerked upward. Betty's right arm twisted behind her, and pain ran from her shoulder to her elbow. She dropped the shovel. Lindsay reached her first. "Don't move it. I can move it. Not yet." Brian stood by the valve box, his face pale. "You shouldn't have been doing that." Betty pressed her arm against her side. "Not now. I told you this wasn't safe. You told me the line didn't matter. That's not what I said. It's close enough." Lindsay guided Betty to the concrete marker and helped her sit. The pain settled into a deep, hot ache. Brian took out his phone. "I'm calling someone. I can walk. You can barely lift your arm. I said I can walk." He wanted to help, but he also wanted the injury to prove him right. Betty could see both things in him, and neither was enough. Lindsay packed the tools. Before they left, she photographed the cleared intake, the locked valve, the directional arrow, and both parcel stamps. Their hour had produced a useful result. It had also ended with the valve still closed. At the urgent care office, an examination and x-ray showed no broken bone. Betty had strained the muscles around her shoulder and irritated an old joint injury she hadn't known she had. She left wearing a sling with instructions not to lift, pull, or reach overhead for at least 2 weeks. Lindsay drove her back to the farmhouse. Brian followed them inside. "You're coming back to Maple Street," he said. "No, you can't stay here with one arm. I'm not leaving because I hurt my shoulder. You can't even wash your hair." "I can wash my hair, Mom." The words sounded like a plea now, but Betty knew what followed pleas in Brian's family. Permission became control before anyone noticed the change. "I'll arrange help," she said. "With what money?" "My money. You have taxes due. I know. And a roof. I know that too." He looked toward Lindsay. "You can't be here every day." "I didn't say I would be," Lindsay replied. Betty removed the sling long enough to settle her coat. The movement hurt. Brian saw her face tighten. "At least stay with Aunt Kathleen." "I own a house that's costing you every day. So is yours. That makes no sense." "It made sense when I paid to keep it running." Brian looked away. Betty had covered groceries, repairs, insurance, and household expenses for years without listing them aloud. She had done it because counting care felt ugly. Brian had benefited from that silence. So had Donald. Brian left without saying goodbye. That afternoon, Betty paid the deposit for the urgent roof repair. She also hired a local worker for 3 days to remove the wet kitchen plaster and carry debris. The payments came from her retirement savings. Writing the checks with her left hand took longer. By evening, her shoulder had swollen beneath the sling. Lindsay made soup and opened the medicine bottle when Betty couldn't press down and turn the cap at the same time. "You don't have to sleep here again," Betty said. "I know. I can manage. I know that too." "Then why are you making the sofa?" "Because Roger Phillips is coming in the morning, and I don't want you trying to clean before he gets here." Betty looked up. "Who is Roger Phillips?" "He runs operations for the Regional Fruit Cooperative." "Why is he coming?" "I sent him the acreage, the water record, and photographs of the trees." "You sent him my papers?" "I sent the recorded paragraph. It's public." "I didn't send the ledger." Betty didn't like being moved ahead without being asked. Lindsay saw it. "I should have called you first," she said. "I'm sorry." "Yes, you should have. I can cancel." Betty considered it. "What does he want?" "Reliable irrigation acreage. The cooperative lost 2 leased orchards last year." "Does he know the water isn't running?" "Yes." "Then don't cancel." Roger arrived at 9 in a mud-spattered car. He wore clean work boots and carried a clipboard, a soil probe, and a folded map. He didn't begin by talking to Lindsay. He offered his hand to Betty. "Mrs. Becker, thank you for letting me visit. It's Betty. I haven't agreed to anything." "I understand." He asked before entering each orchard section. He checked trunk damage, spacing, drainage, and road access. Lindsay answered questions about bloom and disease. Betty showed him Donald's maintenance notebook, but kept it in her own hands. Roger read the flow entries closely. "This is useful operating history," he said. "It's not proof of current delivery." "The valve is locked," Betty said. "Who controls it?" "Becker Produce." Roger looked toward the rise. "That will have to be resolved." At the kitchen table, he spread out the cooperative map. Several shaded areas marked orchards already under contract. A blank space covered the southern Cobden area. "We need acreage that can produce on a schedule," he said. "Dry ground doesn't help us. Ground with a dependable seasonal draw does." "What would this orchard be worth to you?" Betty asked. "In its current condition, not much." He said it without cruelty. "And with working irrigation, with the right verified, the flow tested, and enough viable rows restored, the cooperative could justify a long-term lease." "How long?" He explained the proposed term, renewal options, and the work the cooperative would provide. Workers would prune, replace dead trees in stages, and maintain production rows. Betty would remain the owner. Lindsay could manage the returning trees under the cooperative plan if all sides agreed. Then Roger showed her the total guaranteed lease value, $420,000. Betty kept her eyes on the page. Paid at once? No. There would be an initial deposit after signing, then scheduled payments. The deposit should be enough to handle your tax balance and begin repairs. Should be. We don't issue binding terms until the water right is verified on the ground. I have a certified copy. That proves the document exists. I need a licensed surveyor to match the bearings to the markers and confirm the route. Then I need to see water move through the system. What if Becker Produce refuses? then you may have a right on paper and no reliable delivery date. The cooperative can't build a crop plan around a family argument. The amount changed the room. It didn't make Betty rich, and it wasn't available yet. It showed the scale of what Brian wanted folded into his development parcel for the cost of delinquent taxes. More importantly, it showed what Donald had been trying to preserve, not just a place for Betty to sleep, a separate source of work and income. Roger folded his map. If you want to proceed, I'll prepare a conditional proposal, but the survey and live test come first. Betty looked at the sling, holding her arm still. Keeping the farmhouse was no longer enough. Refusing Brian was no longer enough either. She wanted the orchard working. How quickly can the cooperative move after verification? She asked. Quickly enough for your tax deadline, if the evidence is clean. And if it isn't, then you'll know before you spend another season guessing. Betty slid the certified record across the table. Give me the survey requirements. Roger turned the clipboard around and drew 3 boxes. First, the recorded route has to match the physical route. Second, the markers have to match the bearings. Third, the water has to move from the reservoir intake to the orchard tank under the recorded terms. And the orchard side? I need to know the distribution system can serve viable rows. We can test that without the reservoir, Lindsay said. Slowly, Roger looked at her. With the house, well, with my nurse tank and portable pump. We fill the header from this side and open one lower lateral. It won't prove supply. No, Betty said. It will prove what works after the supply reaches us. Roger nodded. That would answer one question. Betty took a clean sheet of paper from the blue cup. Writing with her left hand made the letters lean, but they were readable. She copied the 3 conditions, then added the orchard side test. What kind of surveyor? She asked. One licensed for boundary work and familiar with old agricultural easements. I can give you 3 names, but you hire the person, not the cooperative. So, the result belongs to me. The report belongs to whoever pays for it. Good. Roger gave her the names and explained what records to send. He also agreed to prepare a conditional proposal stating what the cooperative would offer if the requirements were met. It would not promise money yet, but it would put the terms in writing. Betty signed nothing that morning. Instead, she called each survey office herself. The first couldn't schedule field work for 6 weeks. The second wanted the reservoir owner to order the survey. Betty crossed that name off Roger's list. The third office listened, while she explained that the recorded route crossed one parcel to serve another. The surveyor asked for the certified reservation, the current deeds, Donald's drawing, and photographs of any surviving markers. I can review the papers this week, the surveyor said. If they're usable, I can be on the ground next Thursday. My tax payment is due before the end of next month. That gives us 1 field day in time for a written finding. It doesn't leave much room for weather. What's the deposit? The amount took another noticeable piece from Betty's retirement account. She paid it. When the call ended, Roger checked the date. If the survey works, we can witness a flow test the same day. Brian will have to open the gate. He'll have to receive notice of the survey. I'm done asking him to decide whether I may find out what I own. Roger looked at her for a moment, then nodded. A notice isn't a request for approval. Betty sent the records before lunch. She copied Brian because the survey would cross company land along the recorded route. Her email stated the date, the surveyor's name, and the limited purpose. It also asked Becker Produce to make the valve accessible for the test. She didn't argue about the quitclaim. She didn't mention the back room. She didn't ask what Donald had intended. The evidence would either work or it wouldn't. Lindsay drove home for her portable pump and water tank. While she was gone, Betty and Roger walked the lower rows. Roger marked trees with 3 colors of ribbon. Green meant productive with pruning. Yellow meant uncertain. Red meant remove and replace. Betty counted more green than she expected. These 2 rows can carry a crop, Roger said. Not a large one, but enough to begin. What about the apples? Several need serious pruning. The peach rows will respond faster. Betty touched the bark of a green-marked tree. A small cluster of pink buds had opened since the rain. Donald thought they could return. He kept them alive enough to give you a choice. That was as far as Roger went. He wasn't there to explain Donald to her. Lindsay returned with a white tank strapped into her pickup bed. A hose ran from the tank to a gasoline pump. They positioned the truck near the header and connected the outlet to the orchard side. Betty had to stand back while Lindsay lifted the fittings. Her shoulder ached inside the sling, and being unable to use both hands made her impatient with every small delay. Roger noticed. "If you tear it worse, you'll lose more than 2 weeks. I know what the doctor said." Then let Lindsay carry the wrench. Betty did. Giving a clear instruction was different from being removed from the work. "Open the drain first," she said. "I want the rust out before it reaches the row." Lindsay opened it. The pump coughed, then settled into a steady rhythm. Water entered the header tank from the temporary hose. Rusty flow ran from the drain, turned pale, and finally cleared. The old gauge rose. This time the needle didn't tremble. It climbed slowly under pressure supplied from the orchard side and held. "The gauge works," Lindsay said. Roger photographed the reading. They closed the drain and opened the valve feeding the first lower peach row. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then water bubbled from a cracked riser halfway down the line. Lindsay shut the valve. "There's our first repair." She walked to the break, dug around it, and removed a split coupling. Donald had listed that section in his notebook, but hadn't recorded replacing it. Betty checked the fittings from Lindsay's box. The black one, too large. The one beneath it. Lindsay held it against the pipe. That's it. They replaced the coupling, tightened both clamps, and restarted the pump. Water reached the first emitter near the header, then the second. Down the row, dry outlets began to spit and clear. A thin, steady stream darkened the soil around the first tree. Roger walked beside the line, checking pressure with his hand. "Not enough for production from that tank," he said. "Enough to show the lateral functions." At the far end, the last emitter released a muddy burst and began to run. Lindsay raised one arm. End of row. Betty stood beside the first tree with her useless right arm held against her body. The practical result was modest. One repaired coupling, one functioning gauge, one lower row carrying temporary water. It was the first time she had watched any part of the orchard work under her direction. Roger returned to the header. "I'll include this test in the conditional proposal. When will I have it? Tomorrow afternoon. I need the deposit terms clear." "They will be." "And Lindsay's management role?" "If she wants it." Roger addressed Lindsay directly. "I want it," she said. "As long as my hive lease remains separate." "It will." Betty looked between them. "And no one makes decisions about this house." Roger closed his clipboard. "The cooperative leases production acreage. We don't lease your kitchen." That answer satisfied her. After Roger left, Betty and Lindsay kept water on the row for another hour. They marked 3 clogged emitters and 1 weak section. The soil beneath the trees changed from pale brown to dark, almost black. A Becker produce truck slowed on Waterworks Road. Brian was driving. He turned into the lane but stopped before the farmhouse. His eyes followed the temporary hose from Lindsay's pickup to the header tank. Then he looked down the wet row. Betty waited beside the porch. He got out. "What's that truck doing here?" "Testing the orchard distribution line." "With reservoir water?" "Water from Lindsay's tank." He looked toward the green ribbons Roger had tied on the trees. "Who marked those?" "Roger Phillips." Brian knew the name. Becker Produce had sold fruit through the cooperative in earlier years, before Brian moved more of the company business toward packing and land contracts. What did he want? To inspect the acreage. For what? A possible lease. Brian looked again at the wet soil. "You called the cooperative?" "Lindsay made the first call. Roger dealt with me. You don't have enough producing trees." He counted them. "And you don't have water. That's what next Thursday will establish." Brian's phone sounded in his pocket. He took it out, read something, and looked at Betty. "You hired a surveyor?" "Yes. You scheduled work on company property without my approval. I gave you notice under the access terms. The company has its own survey. Then its markers should match mine. You're spending money, you don't have to prove a right you can't operate. I operated part of it today." He pointed toward Lindsay's tank. "That's hauled water. It tested my line. The reservoir test comes next." Brian walked to the first wet tree. He pressed the toe of his boot into the soil. "What did Phillips offer you?" "Conditional terms." "How much?" "That's my business. It becomes company business if you're drawing from our reservoir. The recorded limits already define the draw. Dad's arrangement was with his own company. It doesn't transfer into a commercial lease. The record says it continues with the orchard. I'm telling you how it was used. You told me it wasn't used." Brian turned away from her. He had lost the easy version of the argument. The orchard was no longer only a ruined farmhouse and a tax bill. Someone outside the family had inspected it. One row had taken water. A survey was scheduled. The possibility now had dates, witnesses, and a price Betty wasn't sharing. He walked back toward his truck. Cancel the survey until the company finishes its review. No. If you force this, you could interfere with the development sale. That sale was never mine to protect. It affects everyone. It affects you. It affects the workers, the company, Aunt Kathleen, all of us. Then you should have checked what crossed the land before promising it. Brian opened his truck door. You have no idea what Dad promised. Neither do you. That's why the records matter. He drove away too fast, throwing gravel against the ditch. Lindsay shut off the portable pump. The sudden quiet made the orchard feel larger. Now he knows Roger's involved, she said. He was going to find out. He'll call the cooperative. Roger deals with the owner. Betty walked into the kitchen. Her shoulder throbbed, and the survey payment had reduced the money available for the roof and taxes. Still, she had something that morning she hadn't possessed the day before. A scheduled verification, written conditions, and one working row. Roger's proposal arrived early the following afternoon. The total lease value was stated exactly, along with the deposit due after verification and signing. The deposit would cover the delinquent taxes if the survey and live test occurred on schedule. Betty printed 2 copies. As the second page came from the printer, Brian sent a new email. Becker Produce now claimed that any seasonal draw described in the old record belonged to company operations, because Donald had maintained both properties together. The company would not open the valve until Betty signed its proposed control agreement. Betty opened the attached control agreement. It did more than arrange the valve test. Becker Produce would decide when the orchard could draw water, how much it could draw, and who could enter the reservoir tract. The company could suspend access during construction or business operations. Any lease involving the orchard would require company approval. At the end, one paragraph stated that Betty accepted the company's interpretation of the old reservation. She called Brian. This doesn't give me access. It gives you control. It sets rules. The rules are already recorded. The old document doesn't account for current operations. It accounts for the orchard. You're planning to hand water use to a cooperative. I'm planning to lease acreage I own. You can't promise them access across company property. The orchard already has access. Then why do you need me to open the gate? Because you put locks on it. Brian went quiet. Betty turned to the final page. Did the developer write this? The company attorney reviewed it. That isn't what I asked. It protects everybody. It lets you stop the water whenever the developer wants. During construction, yes. How long would construction last? We don't know yet. Then this could leave the orchard dry for an entire season. We'd coordinate. You didn't coordinate before you placed test pits over the pipe. The pipe location isn't verified. That's what the survey is for. I'm not allowing the survey unless you sign. Betty set the agreement on the kitchen table. You're using the gate to make me surrender what the record kept. I'm trying to keep one old clause from destroying a company Dad spent his life building. He wrote the clause. He didn't know you'd bring outsiders into it. Roger's cooperative bought fruit from him. That was business. This is family land. The company is yours. The orchard is mine. You only call it family land when you want my part. Brian's breath came through the phone. If you don't sign, Thursday's access is canceled. You already received notice. You do not have permission. I have a recorded access right. Then prove it without entering company property. He ended the call. 5 minutes later, Roger called. Brian contacted our office, he said. He says the water arrangement is disputed. He knew that when you visited. He's now stating that Becker Produce controls any commercial use. Do you believe him? I believe the record needs field verification. That hasn't changed. Has the proposal changed? The terms haven't. The timing may. Betty heard papers moving on his desk. We have another orchard asking for the same seasonal crew, he continued. I can hold your production slot through next Thursday. I can't hold it indefinitely while access is argued. So if Brian delays the survey, I lose the cooperative plan. You may lose this season's slot. I'm not saying you lose every future option. My taxes aren't due in some future season. I know. Will you tell Brian the cooperative won't accept his control agreement? I already told him we deal with the orchard owner, but I can't settle your access problem for you. I didn't ask you to. Roger let that pass. If the surveyor can verify the route and the valve operates, call me from the orchard. I'll come. After the call, Betty stood at the kitchen window. The lower row still showed dark bands where the temporary water had soaked in. Beyond it, The company excavator had moved closer to the service lane. The survey office called next. Brian had notified them that Becker Produce denied entry. "We can still locate the orchard boundary and search for markers on your land," the surveyor said. "We can't verify the full easement route without crossing the reservoir tract." "What happens to my deposit?" "Part covers record review. The field portion can be rescheduled once access is available." "How far out?" 4 to 6 weeks. "That's too late, I understand." "Keep Thursday. We may not be able to complete the work. Come anyway. If the field work is incomplete, the remaining fee is still due." "How much?" the surveyor told her. Betty looked at the roof estimates. The urgent section was under repair, but she had not approved the full replacement. Her retirement balance was already lower by the roof deposit, the survey deposit, utility costs, materials, and urgent care bill. "Keep the date," she said. "I'll pay the field fee." She called her insurance agent and added coverage for the orchard work. That cost more too. By noon, Kathleen arrived carrying a casserole dish and a worried expression. "Brian called me. So is everybody else. He says the development sale could collapse. He said it could interfere. That isn't the same as collapse. He says the buyer won't take land with disputed access running through the middle. The access isn't disputed in the county record. It's disputed by Brian. That doesn't erase it." Kathleen set the casserole beside the stove. "There are people whose jobs depend on Becker Produce. Brian hasn't shown that their jobs depend on my signature. He says the sale would pay company debt and fund the new packing line. He didn't tell me that. He thought you'd take it personally. It is personal when he trades my property for his packing line." Kathleen pulled out a chair but didn't sit. "Could you sign the control agreement for 1 year? It lets the company suspend water during construction. Ask him to change that." "He doesn't want to change it. He wants the orchard included in the development plan without paying its value. $420,000 is only there if everything works." "Yes. And if the pipe is broken, then I'll decide with the truth in front of me." Kathleen pressed her fingers against the chair back. "You and Donald always did this." "Did what?" "Once one of you believed something was right, the other person disappeared from the room." "Donald isn't in this room." "No, Brian is." "Brian put me out of the room." Kathleen flinched. Betty regretted the words only because they hurt Kathleen, not because they were false. "I need you next Thursday," Betty said. "For what?" "You witnessed Donald's signature. I need you to identify it and say what you remember about the transfer. I already told you I didn't read the paper. Then say that. Say only what you know. If I do that in front of Brian, he'll think I chose you. He's asking you to choose silence. That's still a choice." Kathleen picked up her handbag. "I need time. The survey is Thursday. I know when it is." She left the casserole untouched on the counter. That evening, Brian came to the farmhouse. He didn't knock before trying the door. Betty had locked it, so he had to wait on the porch until she opened it. His eyes went first to the sling. "How's your shoulder?" "Sore." He held a brown envelope beneath one arm. "I brought revised terms." "Does the company still control the valve?" "Yes, but we'll guarantee a minimum draw when operations allow." "That isn't a guarantee." "Read it." Betty stepped back from the door, but didn't invite him farther. He entered anyway and placed the envelope on the table. The new agreement included an alternative. If Betty signed the quitclaim before Thursday, Becker Produce would pay the delinquent taxes, reimburse her urgent roof expenses, and return the money she'd spent on the survey. "You added the survey because you know I hired one," she said. "I added it because I don't want you losing savings over this." "What happens to the cooperative lease?" "You walk away from it." "And the orchard?" "It becomes part of the development parcel. The trees, they'll be removed eventually." Brian said it gently, as though gentleness changed what removal meant. Betty read the reimbursement total. It covered nearly everything she'd spent. She could leave the farmhouse before the permanent roof failed. She could keep most of her retirement savings. "Where would I live?" she asked. Brian glanced toward the front room. "You can come back with us. To Maple Street?" "Of course. Where in the house?" "Your room is still there. The back room. For now. We can work out something better later." There it was. He offered shelter as though it belonged to him alone, in exchange for land he claimed had no useful water. "And if I don't sign?" "You risk losing the orchard to taxes anyway. You may lose your savings first. The cooperative could walk, the survey could fail. All of this could be for nothing." Betty looked at her right hand resting inside the sling. Brian wasn't wrong about the risks. That was what made the offer difficult. He softened his voice. "Come home, Mom." She thought of the blue cup being moved, her clothes pressed into boxes, and every paper she had signed because a man at her kitchen table said it was easier. I am home. Brian looked around the half-repaired kitchen. This? Yes. You've been here a week, and you were in my bedroom before Donald's flowers faded. He pulled out a chair and sat. I didn't know what else to do. You could have asked what I wanted. You weren't thinking clearly. I was grieving. That's what I mean. No, it isn't. He slid a pen from the envelope. Betty didn't touch it. If I sign, will you open the valve for a test? There won't be a need. So, the one thing you won't offer is proof. I'm offering security. You're offering dependence. I'm offering family. Family doesn't require a quitclaim at the door. Brian stood so quickly the chair scraped the floor. If this sale fails, don't pretend it has nothing to do with you. If it fails because the orchard has a recorded right, it has something to do with the promise you made before checking. He gathered the papers, but left the pen. At the door, he turned. The gate will stay locked Thursday. Betty watched his truck disappear along the lane. Then she called Kathleen. I'm not signing, she said. Kathleen was quiet. I thought you should know before you decide whether to come. Afterward, Betty transferred the remaining survey fee from her retirement account. She signed the field authorization with her left hand and accepted the chance that the surveyor might confirm only half the route. The one thing that could secure the orchard also required her to risk money, family, and the safe room Brian had offered. Betty sent the authorization before she could begin bargaining with herself. Thursday morning came clear and cold. The surveyor arrived at 7:30 in a white truck carrying a tripod, marking stakes, and a metal detector. He checked Betty's identification, reviewed the certified reservation, and compared it with the current orchard deed. The estate transfer didn't remove the reservation, he said. It follows the parcel described here. Can Becker Produce claim it because Donald owned the company? Betty asked. I don't decide legal arguments. I locate what the recorded documents describe. That's what I hired you to do. He started at the header tank. Lindsay had cleared the grass around the concrete base and exposed the old gauge plate. The surveyor recorded its position, photographed the parcel number, then followed the bearing printed in the reservation. His instrument pointed uphill toward the company fence. The first distance ended at a buried iron pin near the drainage ditch. The metal detector found it beneath 4 inches of soil. Lindsay dug around it with a hand trowel. A small brass cap appeared. Its stamped letters matched the abbreviation on Donald's drawing. One marker, the surveyor said. Does it prove the route? Betty asked. It confirms this point. We need the others. He followed the next bearing to the fence. The line crossed within a few feet of the orange flag marked Test Pit. The excavator had moved again. Its bucket now rested directly over the recorded route. Brian arrived as the surveyor measured the fence crossing. You can't proceed beyond the gate, he said. Betty stood beside the tripod with her arms still in the sling. The survey notice was delivered. I responded. You sent a control agreement, and you refused it. The surveyor stopped adjusting his instrument. I need to know whether I'm entering with permission, he said. Brian pointed toward the orchard. You can work on her side. The next recorded point lies on the reservoir tract. Then note that access was denied. Betty felt the remaining survey fee in every word. If the survey ended at the fence, she would have a marker and an unfinished report. Roger would release the production slot. The tax deadline would continue moving toward her. She took out the certified record. The route includes entry for inspection and maintenance. Brian didn't look at it. My company controls site safety. Then stay with us. I'm not authorizing entry. A car stopped near the farmhouse. Kathleen got out carrying the second certified copy. She walked across the lower rows slowly, avoiding the soft ground. Brian saw her and shook his head. Aunt Kathleen, you shouldn't be involved in this. I became involved when I signed that paper. You don't even remember what it said. I remember more than I did last week. Kathleen reached the fence and opened her copy. The surveyor asked her name and why it appeared beside Donald's signature. Kathleen answered plainly. Donald asked me to witness him signing the reservoir transfer. What do you remember about the signing? Kathleen looked at Brian first. He stared back at her with the expression he had used as a boy when he wanted an adult to change an answer without making him ask. She turned to the surveyor. The papers were on Donald and Betty's dining table. A man handling the transfer explained that the reservoir tract would go into Becker Produce. Donald stopped him before signing. He said the orchard water had to stay with the orchard, no matter what happened to the company land. Betty listened without interrupting. Kathleen continued. The man showed him the reserve paragraph and the route drawing. Donald asked whether it would still work if the company were sold. The man said it would follow the orchard parcel. Donald signed after that. Then I signed as a witness. Brian's face had gone still. You never told Dad you understood any of that, he said. I didn't understand all of it, so now you're filling in details for Mom. No, I'm telling what I heard. You said you didn't read the pages. I didn't. I watched your father refuse to sign until the orchard water was kept out of the transfer. The surveyor photographed Kathleen's certified copy and noted her statement. He didn't treat memory as a substitute for measurement. He returned to his instrument. I still need the remaining points, he said. Brian walked to the gate. He rested one hand on the new silver lock. If I let you in, that doesn't mean I accept her interpretation. No one asked you to, Betty said. It also doesn't authorize opening the valve. This morning is for the route. And after? If the route matches, we test the water, not without the control agreement. Betty looked toward the excavator. You can keep the gate locked. The surveyor will record that you denied access along a recorded route. Roger will know why the test failed. The developer's survey will also have to explain the exception. That sounds like a threat. It's the result of the choice you're making. You could contact the developer and cause trouble. I could. Brian looked at her sharply. Betty had the certified record, the maintenance history, Kathleen's account, and a survey line pointing directly beneath the proposed road. She could send every page to the buyer and demand that the whole development stop. She could use the uncertainty to press Brian for money, company control, or the house on Maple Street. For a moment, she understood why leverage tempted people beyond the thing it was meant to protect. I'm not asking for your company, she said. I'm not asking for the development sale to fail. I'm asking for the orchard route to remain open and the water draw to be honored. You can't promise the sale survives that. No, you couldn't promise it ignored the reservation. Kathleen stepped closer to the gate. Open it, Brian. He looked at her. If this costs the company, you'll both say it was my fault. Kathleen's voice stayed quiet. If you keep it closed, that part will be. Brian took out his keys. He removed the silver padlock first, then the older one. The chains fell against the gate with a heavy rattle. The surveyor entered with Betty, Lindsay, Kathleen, and Brian. No one spoke as they climbed the service lane. At the first reservoir marker, the surveyor cleared vines from the concrete post. The metal cap matched the drawing. He measured its distance from the orchard pin, checked the bearing, and moved toward the valve box. The next point landed beside the box within inches of Donald's recorded position. He checked it twice. The physical route matches the reservation, he said. Brian folded his arms. Within what tolerance? The surveyor gave him the measurement. Does that prove the water right? Brian asked. It verifies that the recorded bearings correspond to surviving markers, the intake route, and the orchard equipment. The operational test is separate, so it doesn't prove water flows. No. Betty appreciated the answer. She hadn't paid him to take her side. They opened the valve box. Water had seeped back into the bottom, but the portable pump cleared it quickly. The locking bar remained across the valve wheel. The surveyor photographed the arrow and orchard parcel number. This equipment sits on the recorded line, he said. Lindsay inspected the bolts holding the locking bar. These can be removed without cutting anything. Brian crouched beside her. That bar was installed for safety. When? Betty asked. I don't know. Donald's last entry says he opened the intake last summer. Then maybe he had a key. What key? Brian examined the bar more closely. A small latch at one end had been closed with a weathered brass lock, not the bright company padlocks from the gate. Lindsay wiped mud from it. That looks like one of Donald's. Betty thought of the ring in the small toolbox. She had removed only the farmhouse key. The rest remained in the kitchen drawer, where she'd placed them after moving in. I have his old keys, she said. Brian stood. You're not opening anything until the company reviews the survey. The survey is happening now. The flow test wasn't authorized. The reservation authorizes operation during irrigation season. We're not finished with the company records. You've had more than a week. That isn't enough time. It was enough time to schedule test pits. Brian looked toward Kathleen. If she opens this and something breaks, Mom could drain the reservoir line or damage the bank. Lindsay answered before Kathleen could. The valve limits flow into a closed orchard pipe. We cleared the intake screen. We'll open it gradually and watch the gauge. I wasn't asking you. No, Betty said. You were trying to frighten your aunt. Brian's face reddened. Betty turned to the surveyor. If the valve opens and water reaches the header tank, will you record the working flow? Yes. I'll record the valve point, gauge response, and delivery at the orchard terminus. I won't certify capacity for a full season from one test. Fair. Roger's car appeared on Waterworks Road below. He turned into the orchard lane and parked near the farmhouse. Brian watched him get out. You called him before you knew the route matched. I told him when the survey started. You planned all of this. I prepared for it. Betty walked back toward the orchard with Lindsay. Kathleen followed. Brian stayed beside the valve box, alone with the surveyor for a moment, then came after them. In the kitchen, Betty laid Donald's keys on the table. There were 11. 4 had paper tags. 3 were unmarked. 1 small brass key carried a smear of faded green paint, the same color as the maintenance notebook. It fit the weathered lock. Betty didn't turn it yet. She looked at Brian. Once this opens, the company can't keep treating the orchard route as something that exists only when you allow it. And once you use it against the sale, don't expect things between us to go back. They can't go back to what they were. Kathleen lowered her eyes. Betty slipped the key from the lock and placed it in her pocket. She would not open the valve while Roger was still walking up from the lane or while the surveyor's equipment remained by the fence. The test would be measured from both ends, with everyone seeing the same result. Set the gauge camera first, she told Lindsay. Then she asked Roger to read the conditional terms aloud at the kitchen table, so Brian would know exactly what the water could make possible and exactly what Betty was choosing to preserve. Roger placed the proposal between them. The cooperative will lease the production acreage from Betty Becker, he read. The lease begins after a licensed survey confirms the recorded route, and a live test confirms delivery to the orchard system. Brian stood by the sink. He refused the chair Kathleen had pulled out for him. What happens if the flow fails? He asked. The proposal expires, and if it works, Betty receives the initial deposit after signing. The cooperative begins restoration under the production schedule. You're assuming she can lease water from the company property. No, Roger said. She's leasing orchard acreage. The recorded reservation supplies the water terms. That reservation came from my father when he controlled both sides. He maintained the orchard as part of company operations. His notebook lists the orchard separately, Betty said. A notebook doesn't decide ownership. The deed does. Brian looked at the certified copy. The company owns the reservoir. Any draw Donald made was through the company, because he owned the company. Mom inherited an old orchard, not part of our operation. You told me the line was dead, Betty said. It should be. Should be? It hasn't been part of our water schedule. Because you didn't know your father used it last year. Brian turned to Roger. You're putting $420,000 behind a family disagreement. I'm putting nothing behind it until the test, Roger said. If the route works under the recorded limits, the cooperative can use the acreage. If it doesn't, we leave. And if it does, you expect Becker Produce to rearrange development work for peach trees. I expect access conditions to be written clearly before our crews arrive. Brian gave a short laugh. That's not going to happen. Betty folded the proposal and returned it to Roger. Then, let's test the part that doesn't depend on his opinion. They walked back to the reservoir. Lindsay set a camera beside the orchard gauge and connected her phone so they could see the needle from the valve site. She opened the header tank drain briefly to confirm it was empty, then closed it. The surveyor checked his measurements one final time. He placed a marker at the valve box and another at the reservoir post. The line between them matched the certified route. Kathleen stood near the concrete post with Donald's maintenance notebook. Brian remained beside the gate until Betty took the green-painted key from her pocket. You're making a mistake, he said. The route matched. That doesn't give you the right to operate company equipment. The valve is stamped with the orchard parcel number. It sits on company land. Because the recorded route crosses company land, it's still our reservoir, and still my draw. Brian stepped between Betty and the valve box. I'm telling you as owner of Becker Produce that this test is not authorized. Betty looked at him. The statement was clear. He had chosen the company's false version fully, even after seeing the markers, the pipe, the notebook, and Donald's recorded reservation. If the water moved, he would no longer be able to say he had misunderstood what Betty was asking to inspect. Please move, she said. No. Kathleen came closer. Brian, this could affect the sale. It probably will, Kathleen said. You're willing to lose what Dad built over this? I watched your father protect the orchard before he gave the reservoir land to the company. You remember one conversation? I remember enough. Brian looked at Betty's sling. You can't even turn that wheel. Betty's face warmed, but she didn't answer quickly. Move away from the box. And if the pipe breaks, we shut the valve. If the bank leaks. The surveyor photographed its condition before the test. If the cooperative demands more water next year, it receives only the recorded draw. Brian had run out of practical objections. What remained was the fact that he no longer decided whether his mother had enough. He stepped aside. Lindsay removed the locking bar after Betty opened the brass lock. She inspected the valve stem, brushed away loose rust, and applied a small amount of lubricant. Stem looks sound, she said. Open it one turn, then wait. Betty set Donald's valve handle over the wheel. It was a short iron tool with a square socket and a crossbar. She fitted it with her left hand. Her shoulder hurt when she leaned forward, even though she kept her right arm close. Lindsay steadied the tool without turning it. Ready at the gauge, Lindsay said. Roger held the phone, where everyone could see the live picture. The needle rested at 0. The surveyor started his timer. Betty pushed the crossbar. The wheel resisted. Brian looked toward the service lane, as if he expected the company land itself to refuse her. Betty adjusted her grip and pressed again. The wheel moved with a dry groan. 1/4, Lindsay said. Betty continued until the wheel completed one turn. Water entered the orchard supply pipe beneath their feet. At first, nothing could be heard. Then, a low vibration traveled through the valve body. Hold there, Lindsay said. They watched the phone. The gauge needle trembled. Brian leaned closer despite himself. It rose above 0, paused, then climbed. Pressure at the orchard end, the surveyor said. That could be trapped water, Brian replied. The needle kept rising. A hollow knock sounded through the buried line. Farther down the slope, the pipe passed beneath the company fence, crossed the ditch, and entered the orchard ground. The vibration followed the same route the surveyor had marked. Lindsay spoke into her phone at the gauge camera. I'm going to the tank. Her picture shook as she carried the phone several yards. The header tank's inlet pipe appeared on the screen. A burst of brown water struck the empty metal bottom. Then another came. The flow steadied. Water ran from the reservoir intake, across Becker produce land, through the orchard valve, and into Betty's header tank. No company schedule created it. No permission from Brian gave it meaning. Donald's reserved route did exactly what the recorded paper said it would do. The surveyor checked the time and gauge reading. He walked downhill beside the marked route while the others followed. At the fence, the pipe continued beneath the exact point his measurements predicted. When they reached the orchard, water was rising inside the tank. Lindsay opened the first lower lateral. The repaired line filled. One emitter began to run, then the next. Roger watched the last outlet release water at the far end of the row. That satisfies operational delivery, he said. The surveyor photographed the tank level, the gauge, and the flowing emitter. The markers, bearings, equipment, and live flow match the recorded reservation, he said. I'll state that in my finding. Brian stood beside the wet row. The company never agreed to a commercial increase. Betty walked toward him. There is no increase. The cooperative follows the recorded limit. The developer planned a road over that pipe. Then the road plan has to protect it. That could change the entire layout. It changes the part that crosses my water route. Brian looked toward the rise. The excavator, survey flags, and proposed service road were still there. The development could continue only with the orchard easement shown as an existing burden on the company land. The sale could not include that route as clear, unrestricted ground. He understood now. Betty saw it in the way he stopped arguing about whether the right existed and began thinking about what the buyer would have to change. Kathleen stood near the header tank with tears in her eyes. She didn't wipe them. Betty looked at her. Don't turn me into a sentence, Kathleen. Help Lindsay check the row. Kathleen nodded and walked toward the last emitter. Betty returned to the valve with the surveyor. They reduced the flow to the lower recorded test rate and watched the gauge hold steady. No water surfaced along the buried route. The reservoir bank remained unchanged. The valve, pipe, gauge, and tank all worked together. Brian followed them halfway up the slope. "Turn it off," he said. "The surveyor has what he needs," Betty replied. "We'll close it after the test reading. I'm asking you to turn it off now." "You aren't asking. You're still trying to decide." He looked at her with open anger. "What do you want from me?" "An access agreement that follows the recorded terms. A key for the company gate during irrigation season. Notice before work occurs near the pipe. Nothing more. And the development sale? Protect the route and sell what you own." "You could have demanded part of the sale." "I don't own part of the reservoir tract. You're going to cost us money anyway." "Then it was never worth what you thought." The surveyor completed his reading. Betty turned the valve closed, one slow rotation at a time. The gauge fell gradually. Water already in the header tank remained available for the lower row. She replaced the locking bar, but kept Donald's brass key. At the farmhouse, the surveyor printed a short field confirmation from his truck. It was not the full written report, but it recorded that the physical markers matched and water had reached the orchard equipment during the observed test. He signed it, handed it to Betty, and left. Roger sat with Betty at the kitchen table. He attached the field confirmation to the cooperative lease and reviewed every payment date, maintenance duty, and access condition. "You retain ownership," he said. "The cooperative receives production use only. The farmhouse is excluded. The water draw stays within the recorded limit. And the hives? Lindsay's lease stays separate." Betty read the last page herself. Brian remained on the porch. He could see through the screen door, but didn't come inside. Roger signed first. Betty removed her sling long enough to hold the pen properly. Her shoulder still hurt, but her hand was steady. She signed her name as owner of Becker Orchard. Roger called the cooperative office and authorized the deposit. The transfer would clear after the final report reached him, but the lease was binding upon that confirmation. Outside, water from the header tank continued moving through the first restored row. Brian watched it for several minutes. Then he took the proposed control agreement from his truck, tore it once across the signature page, and carried the pieces back to the company side. He did not come back to the farmhouse that day. Kathleen stayed until evening. She and Lindsay checked every emitter in the lower row, marking clogged ones with strips of yellow cloth. Roger left after confirming the deposit instructions. The surveyor's full report arrived 2 days later. It stated that the certified bearings matched the surviving markers, the orchard equipment followed the recorded route, and the observed flow reached the header tank. It included photographs of the valve, parcel stamps, gauge reading, and water at the last emitter. Roger accepted the report before noon. The cooperative deposit reached Betty's account the following morning. She drove to the county office with Kathleen. Her shoulder was still in the sling, so Kathleen carried the folder, but handed it back before they reached the payment counter. "This is yours," she said. Betty paid the $18,000 in delinquent taxes. The clerk stamped the receipt and slid it beneath the glass. There was no ceremony. A printer hummed. Someone coughed in the hallway. Betty checked the parcel number twice, folded the receipt, and placed it beside the certified reservation. Outside, Kathleen waited until they reached the car. "I should have stood with you sooner." Betty unlocked the passenger door. "Yes." Kathleen nodded. She had expected that answer and deserved it. "I kept thinking if everybody stayed polite, we were still a family. Polite people can carry your boxes into a back room. I know that now. I knew it while they were doing it." Kathleen's eyes filled, but she didn't ask Betty to comfort her. "What can I do?" she asked. "Come tomorrow. Lindsay needs help removing old ribbon from the apple rows. I can do that. And bring the sheets you promised. They're still in my car. Then bring yourself too." That was not forgiveness in full. It was work with a time attached. At the orchard, the roof crew began replacing the damaged kitchen section. Betty approved the full roof replacement for later in the summer, after Roger helped her place the lease payments on a schedule that protected the taxes, repairs, and her ordinary living costs. Roger never addressed her through Brian. He called Betty when workers needed entry, when the cooperative required a signature, and when the first production supplies were ready. On Monday, he brought a written work plan to the farmhouse. "The crew starts with 2 peach rows and 1 apple row," he said. "They remove dead wood, replace the worst trees, and repair laterals. Nothing expands until we know the existing rows can carry it." "How many workers?" 6 for the first week. "Where will they park?" "Along the south lane, unless you prefer elsewhere." "The south lane is fine. Keep the farmhouse drive open." Roger wrote it down. "Lindsay will supervise orchard work. You approve permanent changes." Betty looked at Lindsay. Does that suit you? It does. And the bees. South edge, same as now. Roger added the hive boundary to the orchard map. What had once depended on Donald remembering a conversation now had names, dates, and separate duties. Lindsay received a management agreement from the cooperative and kept her lease with Betty. She read both at the kitchen table. You taught me to read everything, she said. I taught myself late. Still counts. The first cooperative truck arrived 3 days later, carrying pipe, emitters, pruning equipment, and tree guards. The workers repaired the lower distribution line before touching the trees. Betty watched from the porch because her shoulder still prevented lifting. She could point out fittings from Donald's notebook, approve replacements, and check invoices. It was useful work, though it didn't look like the work she wanted to do. The doctor extended her lifting restriction by another week. You're healing, he said. Healing isn't the same as being ready. She disliked him for being right and followed the restriction anyway. Brian's first response came through email. Becker Produce acknowledged the recorded route, but proposed requiring 48 hours notice before every entry. It also reserved the right to close the service lane during construction. Betty returned the draft with corrections. Routine irrigation access would require a seasonal schedule, not repeated permission. Emergency maintenance could not wait 48 hours. Construction could not block the line or the gate. Becker Produce would provide one gate key to the orchard owner and one to Lindsay as the manager. Brian rejected the Lindsay key. Betty rejected the agreement. 2 days passed. The development survey flags disappeared from the pipe route. New flags appeared farther north, bending the proposed road around the intake and service lane. Brian came to the orchard that afternoon. He parked near the gate and walked down carrying another draft. The buyer changed the layout, he said. I saw. It costs more. I assumed it would. The closing is delayed. How long? 3 weeks if the revised soil work passes. Betty waited. He seemed to want sympathy for a delay he had created by promising land without reading its limits. She had none to offer, but she didn't enjoy his trouble either. The company will sign seasonal access, he said. Lindsay gets a key only while she's under contract with the cooperative. That's reasonable. Emergency entry requires a phone call. A phone call, not approval. Yes. No heavy equipment over the line without written notice. It's in the draft. Betty read it on the porch. Brian stood while she finished every page. The agreement followed the recorded easement. It didn't give Becker Produce control of the cooperative lease or the orchard draw. It required both landowners to protect the shared route and report damage. At the signature line, Betty looked up. Where's my gate key? In the truck. Bring it before I sign. Brian walked back to the truck and returned with 2 keys. One had a tag marked Betty. The other was marked Lindsay. Betty tested both at the gate. They worked. She signed the access agreement. Brian signed for Becker Produce. When he finished, he held out the pen. You can keep it, Betty said. He set it on the porch rail. I'm sorry, he said. Betty closed the agreement folder. For what? His eyes moved toward the farmhouse door. For how everything happened after Dad died. That covers a lot without naming anything. I was trying to keep things moving. You moved me. Brian looked down at the porch boards. I shouldn't have put your things in that room. No. I thought you'd stay a few weeks. Then we'd figure something out. You wanted me settled where I wouldn't interfere. That isn't all it was. It was enough of it. He rubbed one hand over the back of his neck. What do you want me to say? I don't need better words today. He looked toward the orchard workers, replacing a section of line. What do you need? My belongings returned. All of them. Not boxes chosen by your wife. My clothes, kitchen things, papers, photographs, sewing machine, and the cedar chest in the front bedroom. That chest is heavy. The cooperative crew has dollies. You'd let them into the house? They ask, before entering places. Brian accepted the remark without defending himself. I'll bring everything Saturday. Call before you come. All right. He started down the steps. And, Brian. He turned. You don't enter this house because the door happens to be open. His face showed hurt, then irritation, then something closer to understanding. I'll knock. The following Saturday, his truck arrived at 10, exactly when he had said it would. The bed held Betty's cedar chest, sewing machine, clothes, framed photographs, and 7 boxes. His wife had not come. Brian knocked. Betty opened the door but remained in the doorway. "Is this a good time?" he asked. "Yes." He carried the lighter boxes. Lindsay and two cooperative workers moved the cedar chest into the dry front room. Brian asked where Betty wanted each item. He didn't place anything without an answer. One box contained kitchen utensils. Another held Donald's papers from the desk at Maple Street. Betty went through that one immediately. There were insurance notices, old seed catalogs, household receipts, and hospital forms. Nothing changed what the county record and operating line had already proved. Donald's decisive work had been recorded where land work belonged, not saved for one final surprise. Brian brought in the last box and set it beside the sewing machine. "I think that's everything." "My blue winter coat?" He stopped. "It might still be in the hall closet. And the green mixing bowl? I don't know where that is." "It was in the cabinet above the refrigerator. The new refrigerator changed that cabinet. Find it." He nodded. Betty looked through the open door at his empty truck. "Do you want coffee?" Brian seemed surprised. "If you have enough?" "I have enough coffee. I'm asking whether you want some." "Yes." He sat at the kitchen table while Betty filled the machine. He started to reach for the cupboard, then stopped. "Where are the cups?" she pointed. It was an ordinary question, but it was the first one he had asked in her kitchen without assuming the answer belonged to him. Brian took down 2 cups and placed them beside the coffee machine. While it brewed, he looked at the patched kitchen ceiling. "When does the rest of the roof get done?" "July." "You hired the same crew?" "Yes." "They did good work." "They did what they said they would." Brian nodded. He understood the comparison. They drank at the table. He asked about Betty's shoulder and listened to the answer without suggesting where she should live. He didn't ask what the cooperative had paid or how much remained in her account. After 20 minutes, he stood. "I'll find the coat and bowl. Call first." "I will." He called Monday evening. He brought both items Tuesday morning and waited after knocking. The green bowl was wrapped in one of Betty's old kitchen towels. "My wife found it in the basement," he said. "It was in the kitchen. She packed some things quickly." "So did you?" "Yes." He didn't ask to come inside. Betty opened the door wider. "You can put them on the table." He carried them in, then noticed the loose porch rail. "That needs a new base. I have it on my list. I could fix it Saturday. Are you offering or deciding?" "Offering." Betty considered the rail. Donald had built it years earlier, and the lower board had rotted where rain collected near the step. "Come at 9, she said. "Lindsay has a post in her barn that might fit." Brian arrived at 9. He brought his own tools, but used Lindsay's post after measuring it. Betty sat on the porch with her sling removed and watched him cut the base to match the old bracket. He didn't rush. He removed the damaged wood instead of covering it, reset the bracket, and checked the rail with his full weight. When he finished, he handed Betty the receipt for screws and sealant. "I don't need repayment." "That isn't what the receipt is for," he said. "It shows what I used." Betty folded it and placed it with the farmhouse repair papers. The rail held. The next test came when Becker Produce needed to move drilling equipment along the Reservoir Road. Brian called 4 days beforehand. "We need the service lane Wednesday morning," he said. "The cooperative waters the lower rows at 6. "How long?" 2 hours. We can move at 9. The equipment can't park over the line." "I know, and the gate stays accessible." "I know that too." On Wednesday, Betty and Lindsay opened the orchard valve at 6. The gauge rose to the scheduled mark. Water filled the header tank and moved into 3 repaired rows. At 8, they closed the valve and checked the route for leaks. Brian waited with the drilling truck on the north road until Lindsay called him. The truck crossed beyond the protected markers at 9:12. It didn't touch the pipe. Brian could have treated the delay as another injury done to him. Instead, he sent Betty a photograph after the equipment passed. "Route clear," he wrote. Betty saved the message with the access records. The development sale closed later that summer, with the orchard easement shown on every site plan. The proposed road moved north. Becker Produce absorbed the redesign cost, and Brian stopped calling the reservation an old family arrangement. He didn't become a different man all at once. Sometimes he still gave Betty advice as though it were an instruction. Sometimes he spoke of the orchard lease as if Roger had offered it because of the Becker name. Betty corrected him each time. Once, during a Sunday visit, he reached for the farmhouse door without knocking. His hand stopped an inch from the handle. He knocked instead. Betty let him in. Kathleen came to the orchard every Thursday morning. At first, she removed old ribbon and sorted tools. Later, she took responsibility for keeping the farmhouse repair receipts in order, because Betty's filing system bothered her. "You put plumbing under orchard supplies," Kathleen complained. "The plumbing supplies the orchard. A sink washer does not supply peaches. It supplies the person who signs the peach invoices." Kathleen made a separate folder, marked House, and placed it beside the orchard folder. Betty allowed it. Their old ease returned in pieces. It was not the same ease that had depended on avoiding disagreement. Kathleen asked questions now, even when the answers might require her to act. When Brian proposed closing the gate for an entire week during grading, Kathleen didn't call Betty and urge compromise. She went to Brian's office. "The agreement allows scheduled crossings, not closure," she told him. Brian called Betty an hour later with a revised 2-day plan and an alternate entrance for emergencies. Kathleen didn't mention her visit until Betty asked why he had changed his mind. "I thought I should be useful before I came here for coffee," she said. "You can come for coffee without earning it." Kathleen stood still beside the sink. Betty realized no one had ever said that plainly in the Becker family. They had all spent years trading work for a place at the table. "Sit down," Betty said. "The coffee's already made." Lindsay's hives stayed along the south edge. During bloom, the air above them carried a steady hum. She managed the cooperative crew with Donald's notebook in one hand and her own row plan in the other. She did not preserve every tree simply because Donald had touched it. Some were too far gone. Betty and Lindsay marked those together. "This one?" Lindsay asked, beside an old peach tree split near the base. Betty pressed the bark. Half came away in her hand. "Remove it." Donald grafted that row. He also wrote "replace weak stock" before it takes the row down. Lindsay smiled. He did. They removed the dead tree and planted a new one in the same space. The new trunk looked thin beside its older neighbors, but its leaves held firm through the first hot week. Betty's shoulder healed slowly. When the doctor finally released her to lift again, she returned to the orchard with pruning shears. Lindsay took them away. "Start with 10 minutes. I can manage more than 10. You probably can. Then give them back." "In 10 minutes. Betty gave her a look. Lindsay held it calmly. Age had not made Betty helpless. It also had not made her exempt from healing. She spent the 10 minutes checking emitter spacing, then pruned one small branch and stopped when her shoulder tightened. The following week, she worked 20 minutes. By midsummer, the first restored rows held green fruit. Not every branch produced. Some trees needed another season. Roger had planned for that. He visited every other week and dealt with Betty at the kitchen table. When the cooperative wanted to add another apple row, he brought the cost and production estimate before ordering supplies. "What does Lindsay think?" Betty asked. "She thinks the row can carry it. And you?" "I think it's worth doing." "Then we add 1, not 3. Roger changed the order. The farmhouse changed at the same pace. The full roof was replaced. The kitchen ceiling was repaired and painted. Betty chose pale yellow because Donald had always preferred white and had chosen it without asking. The pantry received a new window. The back porch was braced, then rebuilt. Betty kept the old oak cabinets and had the sink pipes replaced. Her cedar chest went into the front bedroom. The sewing machine stood near the window. She unpacked the last box from Maple Street and placed Donald's orchard photograph on the living room wall. The suitcases remained beneath the iron bed for several weeks. Betty knew they were there. She simply didn't feel hurried to prove she would never need them again. The first cooperative pickup came in late summer. The crop was modest, several bins of peaches and early apples from rows that had once been dismissed as finished. Roger arrived with the truck. Lindsay checked the bin weights. Betty signed the delivery sheet on the porch rail Brian had repaired. One peach remained in the bottom of a sorting basket. It was small and unevenly colored, but sound. Betty carried it into the kitchen and cut it into 4 pieces. Kathleen arrived with bread. Lindsay washed her hands at the sink. Roger stayed long enough for coffee. Brian came after work, having called first. Betty placed the peach pieces on the green bowl. "No speeches," she said when Kathleen lifted her cup. "I was going to say the roof looks good. You may say that. The roof looks good." They ate at the kitchen table while workers finished securing empty bins outside. Brian asked Roger about next season's packing schedule. Roger answered, then directed a question about acreage to Betty. Brian waited for her response. It was a small wait, but Betty noticed it. As autumn approached, the orchard drew less water. Lindsay closed laterals row by row. The last scheduled reservoir draw came on a clear morning after the apple pickup. Brian met them at the company gate. He had installed a protective marker beside the buried line and brought copies of the winter maintenance schedule. "I need your signature that the dates work," he told Betty. She read the schedule. "Move the January inspection to the second week. Lindsay will be away during the first." Brian changed it and handed the page back. Betty signed. He looked down toward the farmhouse. "Are you having everyone for supper Sunday?" "I'm having Kathleen and Lindsay." He nodded, accepting the boundary. "Would you like to come at 6?" Betty asked. "Yes. Call if your wife is coming. I need to know how many places to set." "I'll call." That Sunday, he arrived with his wife at 5:55. Both knocked. She brought a replacement pane for the photograph cracked when Betty's belongings were moved. "I should have packed it better," she said. "Yes," Betty replied. They replaced the glass together at the kitchen table. Betty did not tell her the damage no longer mattered. It mattered, and the repair mattered too. After supper, Brian carried plates to the sink without opening cabinets at random. His wife asked where the dish towels were. Kathleen dried. Lindsay brought in honey from the south hives. When they left, each person waited for an invitation to return. In early winter, Betty finally pulled the suitcases from beneath the bed. She opened every zipper, checked the pockets, and folded them flat. She stored one in the attic and gave the other to the cooperative for workers who traveled between orchards. The farmhouse no longer needed to be defended every morning. Its doors locked, its roof held. The tax receipt remained in the house folder, and Donald's maintenance notebook rested beside the current water schedule. If stories about reclaiming dignity after family abandonment matter to you, subscribe and return for the next inheritance story. The following spring, Betty woke before sunrise and switched on the brass floor lamp. Warm light filled the front room. She made coffee, opened the pantry window, and listened to the hives begin their morning hum. Outside, Lindsay checked the new trees while cooperative workers opened the lower laterals. Kathleen's car came slowly up the lane with clean sheets folded on the back seat. A truck paused at the company gate. Brian unlocked it, waved to Lindsay, and waited until the orchard crew passed before closing it again. Betty set 5 cups on the kitchen table. She placed the green bowl in the center and filled it with warm biscuits. No suitcase stood beside the bedroom door. No cardboard box waited to be sorted. The header tank released its first morning flow. Dark lines spread beneath the peach rows as each emitter opened in turn. New leaves moved in the light, and the older trees held fresh white bloom among their restored branches. Betty stood at her kitchen window, watching water move beneath the restored orchard trees.